Yes, and carry you there if you don't instantly obey me, he said, pulling the door open again. Out! For heaven's sake, Cardross, expostulated Nell, in the liveliest dread that Letty would relapse into hysterics. Do pray go away and leave her to me. This is my room, and really you have no right to order Letty out of it. You have an odd notion of my rights, he said grimly. I don't question that she is more welcome in your room than I am, but you will own that I at least have the right to be private with you when I choose. She whitened, but said quietly, Most certainly. And if it is the case that you wish to speak to me, shall we go into my dressing-room? You need not put yourself to so much trouble, declared Letty, trembling with anger. I would not for the world, love, expose you to the sort of ill usage I am compelled to suffer, and to spare you I will go. This very noble speech wiped the thunderous look from Cardross's face, and made him burst out laughing. An unlooked-for event which exacerbated Letty, but considerably relieved Nell. Letty, pausing only to inform her brother that his manners were as disgusting as his disposition was malevolent, swept out of the room, sped on her way by a recommendation to go and take a damper. Cardross then shut the door, saying, Little termagant, I shall be sorry for Allendale if ever she does marry him. She is very much overset by this news that he must leave England so soon, Nell replied excusingly. One cannot but feel for her, and for my part... But I don't wish to tease you any more. Thank God for that. I've had as much as I can support in one day, I assure you. At breakfast, too. I must say, I think that was a very foolish time to choose, admitted Nell. Very. But she would not have found me more persuadable at any other hour, he added, as she sighed. Yes, I am aware of what your sentiments are, but I didn't come to enter into an argument with you over this lamentable affair. What I did come for was to discuss with you what would be the wisest course to pursue now. We may be sure of one thing. Until that regrettable young man is out of the country, there will be no peace for either of us. I shall no doubt be subjected to endless repetitions of today's scene, and you, I suppose, will be obliged to sustain the exhausting role of confidant. Well, I know of no reason why you should be called upon to endure Letty's tantrums, so tell me frankly, if you please, if you would wish me to pack her off to Bath. Upon no account in the world, she said quickly. Surely you were only funning when you made that threat. I was, but I didn't then know that Allendale was to leave England so soon. No, don't think of it. It would be so dreadfully unkind to send her out of town when she has so little time left before Mr. Allendale sails. I am persuaded, too, that she would run away, perhaps to Mrs. Thorne, and you would very much dislike that. Only think how it would look. If I know my Aunt Honoria, she would be given no chance to run away, he said with a wry smile. Don't imagine, however, that I wish to send her there. She's a tiresome little wretch, and when she starts brangling and brawling, I could willingly wring her neck. But so much must be laid at the door of her upbringing that I can't feel she deserves quite such a fate as to be delivered up to that dragon of a female. But I don't wish you to be worn to a bone by her nonsense. Indeed I shan't be, and I beg you won't dream of sending her to Lady Honoria. One thing you may be sure of. You have no need to fear an elopement. No, very true, he agreed. Allendale's inability to support a wife must put that disaster beyond the range of possibility. Yes, but that is not quite just, Cardross, she said reproachfully. He may be an ineligible match for poor Letty, but you cannot doubt that his principles are high, and his sense of propriety too great to allow of his entertaining the thought of an elopement, whatever might be his fortune. His principles and his propriety may be as high as the moon, but I have no great opinion of his resolution, Cardross replied. Had that been on the same level, he would never, as his affairs stand, have allowed his fancy for Letty to carry him to the length of applying to me for her hand. She can be an engaging little devil when she chooses, and I will own myself astonished if he is not being led about with a ring through his nose like a performing bear. My dependence is all upon his straitened circumstances. We will keep Letty in London, then, and you won't blame me if she drives you to distraction." He left the room on these words, and after a discreet interval Miss Sutton returned to it, to complete, with lofty dignity, her task of presenting her mistress suitably coiffed and gowned for an appearance in the Chapel Royal. In the event, Nell decided that the hour was too far advanced to admit of her making anything but an undesirably spectacular arrival at the Chapel Royal, and she presently dismissed her carriage, setting out on foot for the Grosvenor Chapel, which place of worship, though frequented by persons of ton, was hardly worthy of Miss Sutton's best efforts. She was accompanied by Letty, having coaxed that injured damsel to go with her, in the hope that religious exercise would bring her to a more proper frame of mind. Unfortunately, the officiating cleric announced as the text for his sermon a verse from the Epistle to the Philippians. "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory," he pronounced sonorously, "but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves." Nell felt Letty stiffen. Nor was there anything in the discourse that followed to produce in either lady any thought suitable to the Sabbath. So opposite to the events of the morning was the sermon that Nell, far from being edified, was hard put to it to stifle a shocking fit of giggles, while Letty, swelling with wrath, could not afterwards be persuaded that Cardross had not suborned the blameless cleric into choosing a text aimed directly at herself. Upon their return to Grosvenor Square, Nell found a note from Dysart awaiting her. No, the porter informed her, his lordship had not called in person, but had sent it by the hand of his groom. Nell bore it upstairs to her dressing-room to peruse it in private, but its contents were disappointing. The Viscount had scrawled no more than a couple of lines to say that he had received her warning and would take care to keep out of Cardross's way. He remained her affectionate brother Dysart. It was only by the exercise of all the resolution at her command that she was able to refrain from dispatching another letter to him then and there, reminding him of the urgency of her need. Lady Sefton called during the course of the afternoon, and stayed for an hour, uttering cryptic remarks, and peeping at Letty through her fingers as she did so, in a roguish manner that caused that young lady to apostrophize her later as a nasty creature, which was unjust, since beneath her tiresome affectations she was the kindest of creatures. From having been acquainted with Mrs. Allendale for many years, she was pretty well aware of the state of affairs in Grosvenor Square, but even Nell, who liked her, could not acquit her of having come to discover, if she could, any interesting circumstances which had not reached Mrs. Allendale's ears. Hardly had she departed than a much more unwelcome visitor arrived in the person of Lady Cooper, who came with the ostensible object of begging dear Lady Cardross to lend her support to a charitable organization of which she herself was a leading patroness, but lost little time in trying to ferret out in the most caressing way possible all the details of Letty's romance. Nell was mortified indeed to realize that her lord's little sister had become one of the on dit of London, and glancing towards her, thought that she too looked to be rather struck. Lady Cooper, like all the lambs, was possessed of a degree of charm that too often lured the unwary into reposing confidences in her which would later provide her with matter for her witty tongue. But her insinuating manners won her nothing from the two Marian ladies but a stony stare from Letty and from Nell a gentle civility that rebuffed all hints and inquiries, and caused her later to tell her numerous acquaintances that it was a sad pity that so beautiful a creature should be so insufferably insipid. As for her hostesses, no sooner had she taken herself off than they spent an agreeable half-hour abusing her, and in trying to decide whether her worst fault was cutting at people behind their backs, or paying visits in dresses trimmed with positively dirty lace. The evening was enlivened by a spirited attempt made by Letty to convince her brother that in withholding her fortune from her he was guilty of embezzlement. He refused to be drawn into altercation, and even listened to her with great patience when, abandoning this unpromising line of attack, she expatiated on the manifold, if somewhat nebulous, advantages of life in Brazil, and the miseries she would undergo if separated by thousands of miles and an aeon of time from Mr. Allendale. He even tried to coax her into viewing her circumstances with rather more moderation, representing to her in a little amusement, but with a good deal of kindness, that 2 or even 3 years could hardly be thought an aeon of time, and that the possibility of Mr. Allendale's being snatched into marriage by a designing female of Portuguese extraction was too remote to be worthy of consideration. "Don't put yourself in this passion, my dear little sister," he said, taking her hand and giving it a squeeze. "You might be so very much worse off, you know. If I were the unfeeling tyrant you believe me to be, I should have told Allendale never to think of you again, and that is certainly what the world will say I should have done. But I haven't said it, and I shall not. But you must not expect me to allow you, at 17, to throw yourself away on a young man who has neither birth nor position, and stands as yet only on the threshold of his career. I shan't do it, so stop coming to cuffs with me like a good girl and try to be a little wiser." She stared bleakly up into his face, her own very set. "You wouldn't talk so if you had ever loved anyone as I loved Jeremy. You cannot know what it is to form a lasting passion." He dropped her hand. "You are mistaken," he said, in an even tone, and turned away from her to address some light commonplace to his wife. Letty flushed vividly, and said, "I am not mistaken. You may think you have a heart, but you haven't. You don't like to be told that, but it's true." He said over his shoulder, "Letty, you are not only becoming a dead bore, but you want manner as well as sense. Let me tell you that until you learn to behave with propriety, you will make the worst wife imaginable for a diplomat." "Jeremy," said Letty, her bosom heaving, "thinks me perfect." "Which," remarked Cardross, as she slammed herself out of the room, "gives me no very high idea of his understanding." Nell smiled, but said only, as she rose from her chair, "I think I should follow her. She has been very low and depressed all day, and you know how it is with her. When she is happy, I never knew anyone whose spirits mounted so high, but they can be all dashed down in a minute, and then she knocks herself up with one of her fits of crying." "I have very little patience to waste on such distempered freaks," he replied. "The truth is that she has been spoilt to death, and cannot endure to have her will crossed." "Oh, yes," she agreed, "but you would not wish her to cry herself into a fever." "Nonsense," he said irritably, adding, however, after a frowning moment, "I don't wish her to wear your spirits down, at all events. I suppose she will make us endure weeks of sulks. There is no doing anything until Allendale has sailed. But how would it be if I took a house in Brighton, after all, instead of going home to Merion at the end of the season? Do you remember how cross she was when I refused to take her there? I had nothing but scowls from her for a full week. Well, Prinny's parties are not what I would choose for her, but if it would divert her to go there—" Perhaps it would divert her a little, she answered. She raised her eyes and added, after a moment's hesitation, "Not very much, however. I don't mean to vex you, Cardross, but I think you don't perfectly understand. You hope that Letty will forget Mr. Allendale, but she won't. You see, she loves him."
"A child of her age? What does she know of the matter?"
She coloured faintly, and managed to say, though not easily, "I was not very much older when you offered for me." His eyes turned towards her, an arrested expression in them. He did not answer her immediately, and when he did speak, it was with a certain deliberation. "No, you were not, were you?" Chapter 10. The following day was one of gloom, relieved only at nightfall, when the guests began to arrive for a loo party. It began inauspiciously with a further reminder from Madame Laval, which threw Nell into such a fever of apprehension that she could no longer forbear to plague Dysart, but sent round a letter to his lodgings immediately, imploring him either to tell her what she must do, or to negotiate a loan for her with a respectable usurer. Hardly had this been dispatched than Martha came to her with a message from her mistress. Letty, it appeared, had awakened with a toothache after a troubled night, and begged to be excused from accompanying her sister to North Audley Street on a morning visit to the Misses Berry. Nell found the sufferer still abed, a trifle heavy-eyed, but looking remarkably pretty, and without the vestige of a swollen jaw. This seemed to indicate that at least there was no abscess. But when Letty announced, in the voice of one dwindling to decay, that she thought perhaps the pain would go off if she remained quietly in bed, Nell was resolute in insisting that she should visit the dentist. She was not surprised by Letty's reluctance to do so, for the prospect of having a tooth drawn was not one which she herself could have faced with equanimity. But when Letty said at last that she would go, and that Martha should accompany her, so that Nell need not postpone her duty call in North Audley Street, she began to suspect that the toothache was not unconnected with this call. The late Lady Cardross had been a close friend of both the Berry sisters, but her daughter, ungrateful for the kindly interest they took in her, could be depended on to find ingenious excuses for not visiting them. She said that Miss Berry was quizzy, and Miss Agnes cross, and nothing bored her more than to be obliged to drive down to Little Strawberry to spend the day with them. Indeed, she had brightened so perceptibly when Miss Berry, on the occasion of her last visit to the Marian ladies, had confided with a sigh that she was compelled to find a tenant for Little Strawberry, that Nell had been positively ashamed of her, and had later taken her severely to task for heartlessness and incivility. So she now eyed the spoiled beauty measuringly, and said that she herself would take her to visit Mr. Tilton. Had she been feeling less oppressed, she must have laughed at the smouldering look of resentment cast at her from beneath Letty's curling lashes. Happily for Letty, who, by the time she was handed into the sinister chair in Mr. Tilton's room, was in a quake of fright, that worthy practitioner could find nothing amiss with her teeth. In his opinion, the pain she was enduring so bravely was due to a nervous tic. He recommended bed and a few drops of laudanum as a composer, a prescription which Nell inexorably forced her unwilling sister to carry out, with the result that by 4 o'clock Letty announced herself to be perfectly cured, and got up to array herself for the evening's party. She was not in spirits, but somewhat to Nell's surprise, and greatly to her relief, She had made no further reference, after a bitter outburst on the previous evening, to Cardross's cruelty. She seemed to have realized that there could be no moving him, and while the droop to her mouth and the brooding look in her eyes held out every promise of a fit of the sullens, Nell could not but feel she could bear this better than the exhausting and quite fruitless discussions she had been lately compelled to enter into. Dysart did not come, but as the retired gentleman's gentleman in whose establishment he resided rather thought that he had gone out of town to see a prize-fight, this was not wonderful. Nell could only hope that he would find the time to send a written answer to her letter, since, if he were to call in person in Grosvenor Square on the following day, he would not find her at home. She was engaged to take Letty to an al fresco party at Austerley. There was no letter from him in the morning, and had her hostess been any other than Lady Jersey, whom it would be very dangerous to offend, she would have been much inclined to have cried off from the party. It was impossible to do so, however, without giving grave offence, for Lady Jersey had been one of the guests at her loo party, and would certainly not believe any tale of sudden indisposition. "Oh, no," Letty agreed. "It would be quite shocking if you did not go. But I am sure I need not, for I have not the least heart for it, besides being teased by this horrid tick. I mean to stay at home with a shawl round my head." "And Paley's sermons in your hand, I dare say," exclaimed Nell. "For shame, Letty, you have no more tick than I have." "Even if I have not, I won't be forced to go to parties when I am in the deepest affliction," said Letty, flushing. "I don't doubt it would suit Cardross very well to be able to say that if I continue to do so, it is plain he has not done his best to break my heart, but he shan't have that satisfaction, and so you may tell him. I won't go." "Indeed, Letty, you must go," Nell said earnestly. "You cannot surely wish to have your affairs made the subject of gossip. Think how vexed you were when Lady Sefton and Lady Cooper came here on Sunday to try if they could discover what truth there is in the rumours that are going about. Pray do not wear your heart on your sleeve, my dear. It is so very unbecoming." "I won't go," Letty reiterated mulishly. "Won't go where?" asked Cardross, coming into the room in time to hear this declaration. "I won't go to Austerley with Nell, and I don't care if people do gossip." "Of course you will go to Austerley," he said calmly. "What excuse could you possibly offer for crying off?" "I have already told Nell I have the tick, and if she doesn't choose to believe me, she need not. But you can neither of you force me to go." "Doesn't Nell believe you? How unfeeling of her. I believe you, my pet, and I will send a message round to Dr. Bailey desiring him to call." He added, the glimmer of a smile at the back of his eyes, "My own engagements are of no particular moment, and I will promise to remain at home with you." "Rather than endure your company, I will go to Austerley," said Letty, quivering with suppressed fury. "Yes, I thought you would," he observed, holding the door for her to pass out of the room. He raised an eyebrow at Nell, and said, as he shut the door again, "What mischief is she plotting? A clandestine meeting with Allendale?" "I don't know," Nell said worriedly. "I hope not, but I own I can't feel easy about her. I do most sincerely sympathize with her, but it will not do for her to be meeting him in such a way. You won't mention this to her, but I fear she has let her partiality for him be too clearly seen, and there is already a little gossip about her in a certain set." "The devil there is! Take care, then, she doesn't give you the slip. Secret meetings I will not endure." "No, indeed. But I have been wondering, Cardross, if you would permit me to invite Mr. Allendale to dine with us before he leaves England. Poor Letty! It is very hard if she is not even to be granted the opportunity of taking leave of him."
"Lending my countenance to an engagement of which I disapprove," he said quizzically.
No more than you have done already in saying that they may be married when he returns from Brazil, she urged. I am persuaded she would be very sensible of your kindness in granting her that indulgence, and then, you know, there would be no need for her to meet him without our knowledge. He looked sceptical, but shrugged, and said, Very well, you may do as seems best to you. Thank you. I will tell her, and I do hope it may comfort her a little. But Letty, informed of the treat in store, betrayed no enthusiasm for it, nor, when Nell represented to her the impropriety of her meeting Mr. Allendale in secret, did she return any very satisfactory answer. She sat beside Nell in the carriage, looking the embodiment of discontent, but grew rather more cheerful at Austerley. She was always susceptible to admiration, and she received so many compliments on her appearance in a new and dashing dress of pale lemon-coloured crape worn over a slip of white sarcenet, that Nell soon saw, to her relief, that she had abandoned her die-away air, and was prepared to enjoy herself. Shortly after noon, the porter at Cardross House opened the door to the Viscount Dysart. His lordship, who was dressed for travel in breeches and top-boots, trod briskly into the hall and demanded his sister. Upon learning that she had gone off on an expedition of pleasure with the Lady Letitia, he looked first thunderstruck and then wrathful, and exclaimed, Gone to Austerley? Well, hell and the devil confound it! Did she leave any message for me? No, the porter said apologetically. He did not think her ladyship had left a message, unless perhaps with Farley. The Viscount turned an impatient and inquiring look upon Farley, who had appeared from the nether regions, and was bowing to him with stately civility. Did her ladyship say when she would be back? He demanded. No, my lord, merely that she had no expectation of being late. I understand it is an al fresco party, something doubtless in the nature of a picnic. Well, if that don't beat all hollow, said the Viscount involuntarily, and in accents of disgust. I fancy that his lordship has not yet gone out, my lord, if you would care to see him. Mr. Kent was with him, but— No, I won't disturb him if he's got his man of business with him, interrupted Dysart with aplomb. In fact, there's no need to tell him I called. Came to see her ladyship on a private matter. Just so, my lord, said Farley, accepting with a wonderful air of unconsciousness the handsome douceur which the Viscount bestowed on him. I'll step up to her ladyship's dressing-room and write a note to her, said Dysart. And you'd better give me my hat again. I don't want his lordship to catch sight of it. However, the porter undertook to keep the hat hidden from his master's eyes, so Dysart, quite unembarrassed, told him to see that he did, and, declining escort, went off up the broad stairway. As bold as Beecham, that's what he is, remarked the porter, carefully setting the hat down under his huge chair. Down as a hammer, up like a watch-boy. Got some new bobbery on hand from the look in his ogles. Ah, well, he ain't one of the stiff-rumped sort, that's one thing, and it don't matter to him if he swallowed a spider. You won't catch him forgetting to tip a cove, he's earnest. There's plenty as wouldn't give me more than a board for hiding their tiles, but you mark my words if he don't fork out a hind coach wheel. What are you dropping your famble, Mr. Farley? But Farley, revolted by such vulgar curiosity, merely withered him with a stare before retiring again to his own quarters. 20 minutes later, the Viscount came lightly down the stairs again, pausing for a moment on the half-landing to make sure the coast was clear. Encouraged by a nod and a wink from the porter, he descended the last half-flight, and handed over a sealed billet. Give that to her ladyship, will you, George? Yes, my lord. Thank you, my lord, said the porter, as a large and shining coin followed the billet. "And if you want a sure thing for the King's plate at Chester tomorrow," added the Viscount, setting his high-crowned beaver on his head and pulling on his gloves, "put your blunt on cockroach." The porter thanked him again, but with less fervour. A keen student of the turf, he perceived that his lordship had taken to betting the long odds, and he could only regret his imprudence. If that was his new lay, there would be a sad dwindling of the stream of heavy silver coins that fell from his hand. Nell, eagerly deciphering the scrawl some hours later in the privacy of her bedchamber, no sooner made herself mistress of its contents than she read it a second time, more slowly and with a knit brow, unable to decide whether she ought to be consoled by its message or alarmed. "What the devil," wrote Dysart without preamble, "is the use of setting up a squawk for me to come and see you if the next thing you do is to go jauntering off on a picnic? I can't wait to see you, for I'm going out of town for a day or two, but you may as well stop fretting and fuming, because I've hit on a way of setting all to rights, and more besides. I shan't tell you what it is, because 10 to 1 you wouldn't like it, for I never knew anyone with more buffle-headed scruples. I dare say you would have tried to throw a rub in the way had you been at home, so I'm just as glad you're not. If that hog-grubbing mantua-maker of yours starts dunning you again before I get back to town, tell her she shall be paid before the week's out. Now don't be in a pucker, my dear sister, for we shan't fail this time. And don't get to wondering if I've sold you precious sapphires or anything else you dote on, for I have not. Your affectionate brother Dysart. P.S. I greased Farley in the fist not to tell Cardross I was in the house, and your porter too. At least I shall. So don't go blurting it out to him like a ninny-hammer." Having read this twice, Nell's spirits rose a little. There seemed to be no doubt that Dysart really had discovered a way of paying her debt, though what it could be she had not the remotest guess. It made her uneasy to read that she would not like it, but since he had been indignant with her for supposing that he would play the highwayman in earnest, and had now assured her that he had not taken her jewels, she did not think it could be anything very bad. He wrote with such certainty that her first sharp fear died. Even Dysart would not have stated so positively that they would not fail this time had the matter rested on the turn of a card or the fall of the dice. The worst would be if he had backed himself to perform some crazy exploit, and his going out of town made this appear rather probable. Nell knew that he had jumped his horse over that famous dinner-table because someone had betted heavily against his being able to perform the feat. She knew also that no dependence could be placed on his refusing a dangerous wager, because he was so much a stranger to fear that his anxious relatives had more than once entertained the unnerving suspicion that he was incapable of recognizing peril, even though it stared him in the face. Vague but hideous possibilities began to suggest themselves to her, but before she had made herself quite sick with apprehension, common sense reasserted itself, and she thought what a fool she was to suppose that even the most totty-headed of his cronies would offer him a wager, the acceptance of which would put him in danger of breaking his neck. For 24 hours she hung between hope and fear, and then a blow, more crushing than any she had thought possible, almost annihilated her. She had come in to find a message awaiting her that called for an immediate answer, and taking it upstairs with her, sat down at the tambour-top writing-table in her dressing-room to scribble a reply before ringing for Sutton to dress her for dinner. She had just signed her name, and was about to shake the pounce-box over the single sheet of paper, when the door opened behind her, and Sutton's voice said, "Oh, my lady!" Sutton sounded agitated. Thinking that she must suppose herself to have been sent for long since, for the only thing that ever ruffled her stately calm was the degrading suspicion that she had fallen short of her own rigid standard, Nell said cheerfully, Yes, I am come home, but I had not pulled my bell, so don't be thinking you are late. The India muslin with the short train will do very well for tonight.
It's not that, my lady, Sutton said. It is the necklace.
The necklace? Nell repeated, uncomprehendingly.
The necklace of diamonds and emeralds which your ladyship never wears, and which we placed for safety in this very cupboard, said Sutton tragically, between the folds of the blue velvet pelisse your ladyship wore last winter, when no one would think to look for such a thing. Oh, my lady, it is more than an hour since I made the discovery, and how I have found the strength to keep me on my feet I know not. Never in all my years of service has such a thing happened to any of my ladies. Gone, my lady.
Nell sat turned to stone. As the appalling implication flashed into her brain, she found herself unable to move or to speak. The colour drained away from her very lips, but her back was still turned to her dresser, and Sutton did not see how near she was to fainting.
I took your ladyship's winter garments out to brush them, and to be sure there was no moth crept in, which is always my practice, for too often, my lady, and particularly when a garment is trimmed with fur, will it be found that camphor does not prevail. The case the necklace was laid in was there still, but when I lifted it, I thought it felt too light, and the dreadful suspicion came to me. My lady, I opened it, and it was empty.
A voice which Nell knew must be her own, for all it did not seem to belong to her, said, "Good God, what a fright you put me into, Sutton."
My lady?
Sutton sounded startled. Nell set the pounce-box down with a shaking hand, her underlip gripped between her teeth. She had overcome her faintness. One must not faint in such an extremity as this. "But surely I told you, Sutton," she said.
Told me, my lady?
She was beginning to see her way, not more than a few steps of it yet. "Did I not? How stupid! Yet I thought I had done so. Don't be afraid. It hasn't been stolen."
"You have it safe, my lady?"
Sutton cried eagerly.
"Yes, that is, no, I took it to Geoffrey's." "You took it to Geoffrey's, my lady?"
Sutton repeated in an astonished tone.
"Indeed, you never told me. And to remove it from the case, never say you stuffed it into your reticule. My lady, it is not my place to say so, but you should not. Why, you might have dropped it or had it snatched from you. It gives one palpitations only to think of it."
"Nonsense. It was safer by far in my reticule. I hope you may not have told anyone, any of the other servants, that it was stolen. If you have, it must make them very, very uncomfortable, in case they should be suspected of having taken it."
"Not to a living soul have I opened my lips," declared Sutton, drawing herself up rather rigidly. "I should think it very improper, my lady, to make such a disclosure to anyone other than to your ladyship."
"I'm so glad. The thing is, you see, that I have some notion of wearing it as our own ball here. I thought perhaps with the pale green gauze I might not dislike it, so I put it on to see how it would be. Yes, on Thursday last, when you went to visit your sister, and it seemed to me that the clasp was not quite safe. That is why I took it to Geoffrey's."
"Well, my lady,"
said Sutton, rapidly recovering her poise,
"it is a prodigious relief to me to know that my alarm need not have been. I'm sure I was never near in my life to suffering a spasm."
She then folded her lips tightly, dropped a stiff curtsy, and withdrew to the adjoining room to lay out the evening gown of India muslin. Nell tried to rise from her chair, found that her knees were shaking, and sank back again. She had staved off immediate discovery, but what to do next she had no idea, nor could she, for many minutes, force her stunned mind to think. Only pictures, as useless as they were unwelcome, presented themselves to her. Of herself, taking the necklace from its hiding-place to show it to Dysart, months ago. Of Dysart, seated at this very desk, and writing to tell her that he had not taken her sapphires or anything else she doted on. Of Cardross's face, when he had spoken to her so harshly about Dysart, and then quite suddenly had checked himself. She uttered a stifled moan and covered her eyes with her hand. Dysart knew she didn't like the Cardross necklace, but how could he have supposed that it was hers to dispose of at will? Or didn't he care? It was fruitless to ask herself such questions as that. No answer could be forthcoming until Dysart himself gave it to her. That at once raised another question, and a far more urgent one. Where was Dysart? It seemed to her at first incomprehensible that he should have left London, but presently it occurred to her that it might be very dangerous to sell the necklace to any London jeweller or pawnbroker. She knew very little about such matters, but she believed it was quite a famous piece, and certainly there could be no mistaking it if once one had seen it. It had been made a long time ago, in the time of Elizabeth, as a wedding gift from the Cardross of that age to his bride, and it figured in more than one family portrait. It was, moreover, of unusual workmanship, for the jewels were set in the semblance of flowers and foliage, and every flower trembled on the end of a tiny spiral of gold. Nell had worn it once only, at a drawing-room, but although it had excited a good deal of admiration, and not a little curiosity, for no one could imagine what held the jewel clusters quite half an inch clear of Nell's breast, or what caused them to nod and quiver with every movement she made. She knew that it did not really become her. There were too many clusters, too much twisted gold in the foundation from which they sprang, too many leaves of flashing emeralds. She had once told Cardross that he ought to lend it to a museum, but although he had agreed that the proper place for it was in a glass case, he liked her to wear it on state occasions, and so it had never gone to a museum. But even though it had not been publicly shown, she supposed it must be well enough known to make Dysart seek a buyer for it in the provinces. She wondered hopelessly how he expected her to conceal the loss, whether he had found some craftsman skilled enough to copy the necklace, or whether, and this was the best she could hope, he had not sold it, but pledged it. She became aware of Sutton coughing discreetly in the adjoining room. It was growing late, and though one might stand on the brink of a deep chasm of disaster, one was still obliged to dress for dinner. She got up, steadier now, but with so white a face, and such a look of strain in her eyes, that Sutton, when she saw her come into the bedchamber, exclaimed that she was ill. She glanced at her own reflection in the mirror, and was startled to see how haggard she looked. She forced up a smile and said, "Not ill, but I have had the headache all day. You must rouge my cheeks a little." "If I may say it, my lady, I had as lief see you laid down in your bed. I'm sure none knows better than I what it is to have the migraine." Nell shook her head, but she consented to swallow a few drops of laudanum in water, feeling that even though she had no migraine, she had never stood in more urgent need of a composer. The finishing touches had just been put to her toilette when Cardross sought admittance to the room. A sudden terror that Sutton might mention the disappearance of the necklace to him darted through Nell's mind, and made her tongue cleave to the roof of her mouth. But Sutton did not speak. Her face was always rather immobile, and in Cardross's presence it became mask-like. She dropped a slight curtsy, and at once withdrew, according to her correct practice. Nell remembered that she held men in abhorrence, and could breathe again. Cardross was still habited in his morning dress, and the sight of his blue coat and tasselled hessians made Nell recollect with relief that he was not dining at home that evening. She said, with an effort at lightness, "Ah, Daffy Club, I collect." He smiled. "No, Cribb's parlour." "You have no engagement for tonight?" "No, none. I'm quite thankful for it. I've had the headache all day, and I'm not rid of it yet." "For several days, I think." Her eyes flew to his, at once startled and wary. "No, but I own I am worn to a bone with dissipation." "By something, at all events." He spoke very evenly, but his expression alarmed her. "I could almost suppose you to be lovelorn as Letty." She looked rather blindly at him. A tragic little smile wavered on her lips, but she turned her head away, not answering. "I can only wish you a speedy recovery," he said. "Who is the man so fortunate as to have hit your fancy? No doubt some dashing sprig of fashion." "I think you must be trying to joke me," she said, her face still averted. "It is not kind when I have the headache." "You must forgive me." After a slight pause, he added, "I came to tell you, and I trust it may relieve your headache, that I learned today that Allendale has gone into the country for a couple of nights, on a visit to an uncle or some such thing. You may relax your vigilance, and I would he might remain out of town until he sets sail." "I can't blame you for that. I know you have had a great deal to vex you." "Do you?" he said. "Well, it is something that you should own it, I suppose." Chapter 11. The night, though she spent the better part of it in desperate thought, brought Nell no counsel, and certainly no comfort. While Dysart remained out of her reach, there seemed to be nothing she could do. There was no way even of finding him, for though they might know at his lodgings where he had gone, she could not follow him. Yet of all things that was the most important, to find Dysart before he had sold the necklace. She wondered, since that could not be done, whether he would be able to recover it for her. Laval's bill suddenly became a matter of little significance, so much so that she was vaguely surprised she should have thought it so impossible to tell Cardross about it. It seemed a trivial thing, set beside the loss of the necklace, and far too trivial a thing to have led to the disaster which now confronted her. The maxims of her childhood reproached her. Almost she could see Miss Wilby's grave countenance when she lectured her charges on the awful consequences of trying to conceal a fault. Miss Wilby had had plenty of examples to cite, but not even the awe-inspiring tale of the abandoned character whose dreadful end upon the scaffold could be traced back, through a series of crimes, to the fatal day when he had stolen the jam from his mother's cupboard and denied it, was more terrible than the consequences of Nell's attempt to deceive Cardross. She had been afraid that confession would make it impossible for him to believe that she had married him for love, and not for his fortune, and now it seemed dreadfully probable that he would not care any longer whether she loved him or not. She had made him suspicious of her. There was a hard look in his eyes, and not once, since his return from Merrion, had he attempted to do more than kiss her hand. If his love were not already dead, the discovery of her black wickedness would surely give it its coup de grace. She fell asleep with the dawn, but suffered uneasy dreams, and woke to full sunlight with heavy eyes and a heavier heart. She received no morning visit from Cardross, and he had left the house before she emerged from her room, looking, according to his sister, a perfect quiz in a blue and yellow striped waistcoat and a spotted cravat. From this unflattering description, Nell realized that it must be one of the days when the Four Horse Club met in George Street and drove out to dine at Salt Hill.
"Very likely," said Letty, "though why they have to make such figures of themselves I cannot conceive."
She then informed Nell that her cousin Selina had sent a note round to beg her to go with her in her mamma's carriage to choose a wedding gift for Fanny. She added, with the light of battle in her eyes, that she supposed there could be no objection to that scheme. Nell was glad to be able to acquiesce. She had no great liking for Miss Selina Thorne, but if Mr. Allendale had gone into the country, it was hard to see what harm could come of allowing Letty out of her sight for an hour or two. She did indeed suggest, when she saw that Mrs. Thorne had not sent a maid with her daughter, that Martha should accompany the young ladies, but Letty scoffed at her for a prude, and Selina exclaimed rather pertly that of all odious things a servant listening to one's private conversations was the worst. Nell had a momentary vision of the cousins with their heads together, giggling over secrets, and thought, not for the first time, that Selina would have been better for a course of Miss Wilby's discipline. She said no more, however, and after arguing for a few minutes about the nature of the gifts to be chosen, the girls went away, their first objective, Nell guessed, being the Pantheon Bazaar, in which fascinating mart, though they might not discover a suitable wedding gift, they would certainly fritter away a good deal of money on ingenious trifles for themselves. Nell was too glad to see Letty in better spirits, and too anxious to be left to the indulgence of some quiet reflection, to raise any objection to this programme. Her quiet reflection did nothing to raise the tone of her own spirits, but when Letty returned, much later in the day, she was seen to be in a sunnier humour than she had been for some time. As Nell had expected, she was laden with parcels, most of which were found to contain such doubtful purchases as a pair of percale gloves, which it had seemed a pity not to buy, since they were so cheap, but which, on second thoughts, Letty thought she would give to Martha, a stocking purse, several faggots of artificial flowers, one of which she generously presented to Nell, a gauze apron, 2 muslin handkerchiefs, a box of honeysuckle soap, and a Turkish lappet, which had hit her fancy at the time, but which, now that she saw it again, was quite hideous. For Fanny, she had purchased a gold armlet and earrings, a handsome gift which made Nell exclaim, "Good gracious! I had not thought you could afford anything so dear." "No, but I asked Giles, and he said I might purchase what I liked," replied Letty, unconcernedly. This seemed to indicate that a truce had been declared. The impression was strengthened by Letty's next words, which were uttered after a thoughtful pause. "He says it is true that he told you might invite Jeremy to dine here." "Of course it's true." "Well, I thought very likely it was the hum, but if it was not, I expect it was your notion, and you coaxed him into it. I am very much obliged to you. When will you write to Jeremy?" "Whenever you wish," Nell replied. "Now, if you desire me to." "Oh, no, there is no occasion for you to do so now. He is gone to visit his uncle, you know, and he did not expect to be in London again until tomorrow evening. I was thinking, love, that if we were to go to Almack's on Friday, I dare say we should meet him there, and then, don't you think, we could discover when it would be convenient for him to come to us?" It was evident from this speech that an assignation at Almack's had already been made. Nell did not feel equal to giving a promise that she would attend the assembly, but she said that she would do so if she felt well enough, and with this Letty, after a little more coaxing, was obliged to be content. In the state of wretchedness she was in, Nell could not think of taking part in such a frivolous entertainment without a shudder, but she did manage to extract a grain of comfort from the reflection that the first fury of Letty's passionate despair had worn itself out, and she was not contemplating any immediate act of imprudence. The more compliant mood lasted. Letty was able to see Cardross again without ripping up, and although her spirits were languid, and her manner lacked its usual liveliness, there could be no doubt that she was making a serious endeavour to mend her temper. The hope that Dysart would come to her kept Nell at home on the following day. Cardross was to have escorted both his ladies to a review in Hyde Park, but in the end only Letty went with him. She had said at first that she was in no humour for it, but upon Nell's appealing to her to bear Cardross company, so that she herself might nurse a headache at home, she at once agreed to go. She was too much absorbed in her own troubles to perceive that her sister-in-law was looking far from well until her attention was directed to this circumstance. But when Sutton told her that she was in quite a worry over her mistress, she was instantly ready not only to do what was asked of her, but a great deal that was not asked, such as placing cushions behind Nell's head, a stool under her feet, and a shawl across her knees, bathing her brow with vinegar, offering her all manner of remedies from hartshorn to camphor, and inquiring every few minutes if she felt a degree better. Nell endured these ministrations patiently, but Cardross, coming to see how she did, exclaimed, "Good God, Letty, don't fidget her so! Enough to drive her into a fever!" Letty was inclined to take affront at this, but he pushed her out of the room without compunction, telling her to go and put her hat on, since his curricle would be at the door in 5 minutes. "And if you want me to let you handle the ribbons, take that pout from your face," he recommended. He turned and went back to Nell's chair, and held her wrist in his hand for a moment. Under his fingers her pulse was flurried enough to make him say, "If you're not better by the time we return, I'll send for Bailey."
"Oh, no, pray do not. Indeed, I'm not ill. Only I still have the headache, and it seems foolish to go out in this hot sun," she replied quickly. "I shall be perfectly well presently."
"I hope you may be," he said, laying her hand down again. He glanced at Sutton. "Take care of her ladyship." An extremely dignified curtsy was all the answer vouchsafed to this behest. From the dresser's downcast eyes and lifted brows, he might have inferred that she was deeply offended, but he did not look at her again. His gaze had returned to his wife's face. His expression seemed to her to soften, and after hesitating for a moment, he bent over her and lightly kissed her cheek. "Poor Nell," he said. He was gone before she could say a word, leaving her with an almost overpowering inclination to cry her heart out. She managed to overcome it, and to assure Sutton, with very tolerable composure, that she was already better, and needed nothing to restore her to her usual health, but to be left to rest quietly for an hour or so. She believed that she might fall asleep if no one came to disturb her. It would have been well for her if she had done so, but sleep had never been farther from her. She tried to interest herself in a new novel, and discovered that she had read 3 pages without taking in the sense of one word. Every vehicle heard approaching in the square below brought her to her feet and hurrying to the window, and when she took up her embroidery, determined to employ herself rather than to pace about the room, a prey to most harrowing reflections, she found that her hands were so unsteady as to make it impossible for her to set a stitch. Dysart did not come, and so severe was her disappointment that it took all the resolution of which she was capable to enable her to meet Cardross upon his return with a calm countenance. Her training stood her in good stead. No one could have supposed from her demeanour that her brain was in a turmoil. And when it was suggested to her that she might prefer not to go to the Italian opera that evening, she laughed away this solicitude, telling her husband and sister-in-law that they must not try to wrap her in cotton. Dysart walked in on her, unannounced, just before noon on the following morning. She was sitting with Letty in the drawing-room, endeavouring to soothe feelings very much ruffled by a visit from Miss Berry. The good lady had called a little earlier to inquire after her state of health, but upon Letty's coming into the room had speedily infuriated that injured damsel by entering with great earnestness into a discussion of her affairs. What she said held excellent common sense, and did honour to her heart as much as to her judgment, but her manner was unfortunate. A trick she had of repeating over and over again some catch-phrase could only irritate. She had a way of talking in a hurried, over-emphatic style, and the caresses and exaggerated terms of affection she employed in trying to win more confidence than was voluntarily reposed in her served only to set up Letty's back. She had not long left the house when Dysart entered it, and when he walked into the drawing-room the angry flush had not faded from Letty's cheeks.
"Dysart!"
Nell cried, springing up from her chair. "Hello, Nell," he responded with a cheerful nonchalance. "I hoped I should find you at home." He looked critically at Letty, and inquired in a brotherly fashion, "What's put you in a miff?"
"If nothing else had, you would," retorted Letty with spirit, but a distressing want of civility. "No doubt, dearest Nell, you would like to be private with your detestable brother. I would as lief converse with the muffin-man, so I will go and sit in the library until he has gone away again."
"Well, if I ever saw such a spitfire," remarked the Viscount, mildly surprised. "What have I done to set you up on the high ropes?" Deigning no other answer than a withering look of scorn, Letty swept out of the room with her head in the air. He shut the door behind her, saying, "Too hot at hand by half."
"Oh, Di, thank God you are here at last," Nell uttered with suppressed agitation. "I have been in such distress, such agony of mind."
"Lord, you're as bad as that silly chit," said Dysart, diving a hand into his pocket and bringing forth a roll of banknotes. "There you are, you goose. Didn't I promise you I wouldn't make a mull of it this time?" She would not take the roll, almost recoiling from it, and crying with bitter reproach, "How could you? Oh, Di, Di, what have you done? You cannot have supposed that I would accept money obtained in such a way." "I might have known it," ejaculated Dysart disgustedly. "In fact, I did know it, and I took dashed good care not to tell you what I meant to do. When it comes to flying into distempered freaks, damn me if there's a penny to choose between you and Mamma." "Distempered freaks," she repeated, gazing at him in dismay. "You call it that? Oh, Dysart!" "Yes, I dashed well do call it that," replied his lordship, his eye kindling. "And let me tell you, my girl, that these methody airs don't become you. Besides, it's all slum. I may have to listen to that sort of flummery from Mamma, but I'll be damned if I will from you. What's more, it's coming in a trifle too strong. Let me tell you, my pious little sister, that if Felix Hethersett hadn't thrown a rub in your way, you'd have borrowed the blunt from that old Pope in Clarges Street." "But, Di," she stammered, "the cases are not comparable. Perhaps it was wrong of me. Indeed, I know it was wrong, but it was not wicked." "Oh, stop acting that dunce," he said, exasperated. "Of all the fustian nonsense I ever heard in my life, what the devil's come over you, Nell? You were never used to raise such a breeze for nothing at all." "I can't think it nothing. Surely you do not," she said imploringly. "I had rather have done anything than lead you into this. I never dreamed.
Oh, if I had but told Cardross the truth. Well, if you meant to kick up such a dust as this, I'm dashed sorry you didn't tell him, said Dysart. I always knew you had more hair than wit, but it seems to me it's worse than that. Queer in your attic, that's what you are, Nell. First you plagued the life out of me to raise the recruits for you, and where you thought I could lay my hands on 3 centuries, the Lord knows. Then, when I hit on a way of doing the thing neatly, you've no more sense in your cock loft than to cry rope on me. And now, when I hand you a roll of soft, you ain't even grateful, but start reading me a damn sermon. And when I think that I came posting back to town the instant the thing came off right, because I knew you'd fall into a fit of the dismals or go off on some toddy-headed start if I didn't, I've a dashed good mind to let you get yourself out of your fix as best you can. It's all my fault, she said mournfully, wringing her hands. I was in such desperate straits, and begged you so foolishly to help me.
Now don't put yourself in a taking over that, he interrupted. I don't say I was best pleased at the time. And now that all's right, I don't mind owning to you that there was a moment when I thought I was at a stand. But I'm not complaining. There's no saying that what if you hadn't kept on teasing me to dub up the possibles, I mightn't be standing here today, pretty well able to buy an abbey.
Dysart, no.
Well, no, it ain't as much as that, he acknowledged. And as a matter of fact, I thought it would be more. Still, it's enough to keep me living as high as a coach horse for a while, and that'll be a pleasant change, I can tell you. Lord, Nell, I was so monstrously in the wind that I've not much more than white wool left to play with. 6,700 pounds is what I've made out of it, and that's not counting my debt to you and the monkey I owed Corny.
She grasped the back of a chair for support, for her knees were shaking under her. From out a white face, her eyes stared up at her beloved brother in horror. She felt as though she were suffocating, and could only just manage to say, "Don't die, oh, die, you could not money gained in such a way." The thought of his sudden affluence had banished the frown from his brow, but at this it descended again.
"Oh," he said ominously, "and why could I not?"
"Dysart, you must know why you cannot," she cried hotly.
"That's where you're out, my girl, because I don't know. And there's something else I don't know," he said grimly. "Perhaps you'll be so obliging, my lady, as to tell me what you did with the blunt you won at Doncaster last year. Very pretty talking nisses from a chit have backed 3 winners in a row. You weren't blue devil then, were you? Oh, no, you were in high croak." He shot out an accusing finger at her. "And don't you try to tell me I didn't go to Doncaster, because I was there myself. Cardross took you to stay at Castle Howard with the Morpeths, and you drove over from there with a whole party of people. It's no use denying it. Why, I remember how you told me that the only thing you didn't like at Castle Howard was the old Earl, because there was so much starch in him that he frightened you to death. Now then, how do you mean to answer that, pray?"
Utterly bewildered, she stammered, But, I don't understand. What has that to say to anything? I remember perfectly, but—" She broke off suddenly and gave a gasp. "Oh! Can it be possible that— Oh, Di! Dearest, dearest Di! Did you win that money?"
"Well, of course I did," he replied, in the liveliest astonishment. "How the devil else was I to do that trick?"
She sank down on the sofa, wavering between tears and laughter. "Oh, how stupid I've been! I thought— Oh, never mind that. Di, has the luck changed at last? Tell me how it was. Where have you been? How— Oh, tell me everything."
"Chester for the King's plate," he replied, eyeing her uneasily.
She seemed to him to be in queer stirrups, and he was just about to ask her if she felt quite the thing, when a happy explanation occurred to him.
"I say, Nell, you haven't sprained your ankle, have you?" he demanded, grinning at her. Sprained my ankle? No, she answered, a good deal surprised.
What I mean is, in the family way.
She shook her head, colouring. No, she said sadly.
Oh. Well, that must be it.
He saw that her face was downcast and said bracingly,
No need to be moped. Plenty of time yet before you need to think of setting up your nursery. Shouldn't wonder at it if you were like Mamma.
Yes, that is what she thinks, but... Oh, never mind that. Tell me how all this came about. He sat down beside her. Lord, it was the oddest thing. A 15-to-1 chance, Nell. And I'd no more notion of laying my blunt on it than the man in the moon. Well, I didn't know the horse existed, and as for backing it, anyone would have laid you odds there was only one horse entered that could beat Firebrand, and that was Milksop. But what do you think happened to me? She shook her head wonderingly, and he gave a chuckle.
Sort of thing that only comes to a man once in a lifetime. It was on a Saturday night that it started. I thought I might take a look in at the... Well, doesn't signify telling you the name of the place. You wouldn't know it. It's a club I go to now and then. Anyway, I called for a tankard there, drank it off, and damn me, if there wasn't a great cockroach in the pot.
Ugh! Exclaimed Nell, shuddering.
Yes, didn't like it above half myself, agreed the Viscount.
But the queer thing about it was that it wasn't dead.
Seemed a bit lushy when I tipped it out on the table, but dash it, what could you expect? Got quite lively after a while, so we matched it against a spider that a friend of mine picked off its web.
Cockroaches and spiders, interrupted Nell, aghast.
Oh, Lord, yes, dozens of them, places full of 'em.
But I thought, how very shocking. It must be a sadly dirty house.
Yes, I expect it is, he agreed. In fact, I know it is, but that don't signify. The thing is, most of the company fancied the spider. Well, I did myself, to tell you the truth, for it was a stout-looking runner, with a set of capital legs to it. I didn't back it, of course, because the cockroach was my entry, but I never thought to see the cockroach win.
And it did? Nell asked anxiously.
Won by half the length of the course, said the Viscount. That was the table. We had 'em lined up, and I must say I thought my entry was still a trifle bosky, and I dare say he was, but no sooner did I give him the office, with a fork, than off he went in a fine burst, straight down the course for the winning post. Mind you, the spider had it in him to beat him. Devilish good mover, I give him my word. The trouble with him was that he was a refuser. If he didn't fold his legs up under him, he went dashing off in circles. Now, young Johnny Cockroach jibbed a trifle, but every time I used my persuader on him, off he went again at a slapping pace, and always straight ahead. You wouldn't have thought to look at him that he was such a good mover. A daisy cutter is what I thought, and so he was, but a regular Trojan for all that.
Oh, Di, how absurd you are, Nell exclaimed, laughing. And you won all that money on the creature.
No, of course I didn't. That was only funny. Didn't win much more than a pony on him.
What happened to him? Nell could not help asking.
How should I know? Went back to his stable, I dare say. Wasn't paying much heed to him, or to any of it if it comes to that. Well, what I mean is, never thought another thing about it once the race was won. There wasn't any reason why I should. But, Nell, when I went to bed on Sunday night, I pulled back the clothes, and damn me if there wasn't a cockroach right in the middle of the bed. How I came to be such a gudgeon as not to see then what it meant still has me in a puzzle. I didn't. It wasn't till Monday that it fairly burst on me. I went just to see how they were betting their money at Tats, and who should be there but old Jerry Stowe. No, you don't know him. Not the kind of fellow you would know, but he's a mighty safe man at the corner, I can tell you. Did him a trifling service once, no great matter, but to hear him you'd think I'd saved his life. Well, The long and the short of it was that he'd told me in my ear to put all my blunt on cockroach for the King's plate at Chester. That fairly sent me to grass, I can tell you. I hadn't even heard of the tip. Didn't mean to bet on the race at all, because I've no fancy for an odds-on chance, and to my mind there wasn't a horse entered, barring Milksop, that could beat Firebrand. But of course, as soon as Jerry tipped me the office, that settled it. Taking one thing with another, I could see cockroach was a certainty. The only trouble was how the deuce was I to raise enough mint sauce to make the thing worthwhile. He paused, frowning. The amusement was quenched in Nell's eyes, which were fixed on his face in painful inquiry. "Did something I've never done before, and never thought I should do," he said, shaking his head. "Too damned ramshackle by half. Mind, if I hadn't known the horse couldn't lose, wouldn't have done it." She smiled faintly. "What did you do, Di? Tell me, pray."
"Borrowed a monkey from Corney," he replied briefly.
"Oh!" It was a long sigh of unutterable relief.
"Is that all? I thought you meant you had done something shocking."
"Well, if you don't know that it's shocking to go breaking shins amongst your friends, it's time someone told you," said the Viscount severely. "What if the horse hadn't won? A pretty Captain Sharp I should have looked."
Yes, but I am persuaded Mr. Pancott wouldn't have thought so, or cared a jot."
"No, of course he wouldn't. But that don't make it any better, worse, in fact. I don't mind owing blunt to the regular brags, or to a parcel of tradesmen, but I'm not the sort of Roman that sponges on my friends, I'll have you know." She was abashed, and docilely begged his pardon. He regarded her frowningly, and suddenly said, "If you didn't kick up all that dust because you knew I'd won the money at Chester races, how did you think I'd come by it?" She hung her head, blushing.
"Oh, Dysart, I have been so foolish."
"I dare say, but that don't tell me anything. What made you fly into that odd rage? You aren't going to tell me you thought I'd held up a coach and robbed some stranger?"
"No.
Worse," she whispered, pressing a hand to one hot cheek. "Don't be such sapskull. I should like to know what you imagine could be worse than that," he said impatiently.
"Oh, Dysart, forgive me. I thought you had taken the necklace."
"No, you didn't. I particularly told you I hadn't made off with your precious jewels, so stop bamming me."
"Not my jewels. The Cardross necklace."
"What?"
She quailed involuntarily.
"You thought I had stolen the Cardross necklace?" said the Viscount, with awful deliberation. "Are you mad, girl?"
"I think I must have run mad," she confessed. "It was because you held me up. I never should have thought it if you hadn't meant to seize my jewels and sell them for me. I thought—"
"I want to hear no more of what you thought," interrupted Dysart terribly. "Good God! Are you going to sit there telling me you believed me capable of making off with something that don't belong to either of us?"
No, I mean, I wondered if perhaps you thought it was mine, and you knew I didn't care for it, so—"
"So I prigged it while you were out of the way. A thing worth the Lord only knows how many thousands of pounds," he cut in wrathfully, "just to pay your trumpery debt, too. Oh, no, I was forgetting, not just to pay your debt, was it? I gave you 3 centuries, devilish handsome of me, by God, and pouched over 7,000. Do you happen to know what I did with the thing? Did I sell it to some fence or other, or did I lodge it with a spouter? I don't wonder at it that I found you in such a grand fuss. The only thing that I wonder at is how I contrived to keep out of Newgate."
He had sprung up from the sofa and was striding about the room in a black rage that made her quake. She dared not approach him, but she said imploringly, It was very bad of me, and indeed I beg your pardon. But if you knew how it was— Oh, Dysart, don't be so angry with me. Everything has been so dreadful, and I fear my mind is less strong than I had believed it. I knew how much I had teased you, and when I read your letter my first thought was that you had backed yourself to win some reckless wager. I didn't entertain the least suspicion then. It was when I knew the necklace had gone, and you had written the letter in the very room where it was hidden, and I remembered that I had shown you once. Oh, it was unpardonable of me, but— He had stopped his pacing, and was standing staring down at her, an arrested expression in his eyes.
"Just a moment," he interrupted sharply. "You don't mean that, do you? That the necklace has gone?"
"Yes, I do mean it. That was what overthrew my mind, Di."
"My God!" he ejaculated, turning a little pale. "When did you discover this?"
"The next day, on Tuesday. It wasn't I, but my dresser who discovered it. She told me immediately, and that was when it flashed into my mind that— If I had had time to think, perhaps I should not, but I hadn't.
Never mind that. What did you say to your woman?"
"That I had taken the necklace to Geoffrey's to have the clasp mended. She assured me she hadn't spoken of the loss to a soul, and I told her not to do so, and I am persuaded she has not."
"Cardross doesn't know?"
No. How could you think I would tell him when I thought it was you who had taken the necklace?"
He drew an audible breath. "That's the dandy, isn't it?" he said with blighting sarcasm. "It's been missing for 3 days, and your damned dresser knows it, and you haven't seen fit to tell Cardross or to make the least push to recover it. Famous! And now what do you mean to do, my girl?"
Chapter 12. For perhaps half a minute Nell sat staring up at the Viscount, the colour slowly draining from her face. In the flood of relief that had swept over her, her only thoughts had been of thankfulness that Dysart had not taken the necklace, and of remorse for having so misjudged him. But his words brought her back to earth with a jarring thud. She lifted a hand to her brow.
"Oh, heavens," she said, in the thread of a voice, "I hadn't considered. Dysart, what must I do?"
"I don't know," he replied unhelpfully.
"Someone did indeed steal it. But who? This is dreadful. It must have been one of the servants, someone who knew where it was hidden. And how can I tell who may have known of it? The chambermaid whom Mrs. Clopton turned off a month ago. I cannot think it."
"Can't you?" said his lordship acidly. "Much obliged to you, my lady."
"Don't die," she begged. "If you had taken it, I knew you had done it only for my sake. But now— It might have been any of them, at any time. It was not necessary to know where it was kept. It must be known to them all that I have it and never wear it, and only think how many opportunities there must be for persons living in this house to search for the hiding-place. And when they had found it, they would guess that I should not discover the loss for months, perhaps. Had it not been for Sutton's care in taking out my winter clothes to brush them, I might have known nothing."
"It ain't a bit of use talking about what might have happened," said Dysart. "It's what did happen that has put you in the basket. Unless you can stop your dresser's mouth, it's bound to come out that you knew the necklace had been stolen 3 days before you said a word about it to Cardross. Well, you know the woman better than I do. Can you bribe her to tell the same story you mean to tell?"
I don't know," she said slowly. "It's of no consequence, however. I will not do it."
"I dare say you're right," he agreed. "Too damn risky. She'd be bound to guess there was something heavy-cavey afoot, and once she knew you were scared of Cardross's getting wind of it, she'd very likely bleed you white. Lord, there'd be no end to it."
"I don't think it. It is not for that reason. Dysart, all this trouble has come upon me because I set out to deceive Cardross, and it has grown and grown until—" She broke off with a shudder. I must tell him the truth. I must tell him immediately. She got up as she spoke, but the Viscount said dampingly, "Well, you won't do that because he ain't in. Told Farley he wouldn't be back till 5 or thereabouts."
"Not till 5? Oh, if my courage does not fail."
"Do you want me to see him with you?" he demanded.
"You? Oh, no, I must see him alone."
"Well, it's my belief the thing will come off a dashed sight better if you do," he said frankly. "It ain't that I mind seeing him, because now the dibs are in tune again, there's no reason why I should. But for one thing, I'm pledged to Corney, and for another, Cardross won't like it if you take me along like a dashed bodyguard. That's the way to get his back up at the very start. Besides, you don't need a bodyguard. I don't say he isn't going to be devilish angry, because it stands to reason he's bound to be, but you needn't be afraid he won't come around. He will, all the quicker if I'm not there. He don't love me, but he loves you all right and tight." She said nothing, and after a moment he held out the banknotes to her again. "Take 'em. No need to mention the mantua maker's bill to him unless you choose. You may put the whole on to me. I had 3 centuries from you, and now I've paid 'em back. I dare say that'll surprise him more than if you told him I'd prigged his damned heirloom." At these biting words she flung her arms round his neck, vehemently asserting that no one could ever believe such a thing of him, and again begging him to forgive her. "Yes, very well, but you needn't think I'm pleased with you, for I'm not," responded Dysart, disengaging himself from her embrace. "Not a bit of use hanging round my neck and playing off your cajolery. I'm not Cardross, and mind this, the next time you run into trouble, don't you come to me to drag you out of it."
"No," Nell said meekly.
"I'll be off now," he announced. "No getting into high fidgets, Nell." She shook her head. "And no turning short about, either," he warned her.
"No, I promise you I mean to tell Cardross as soon as he returns."
"Well, see you do," he said, relenting sufficiently to bestow a brief hug upon her. "I suppose I ought to stay to bring you up to scratch, but I haven't seen Corney yet, and I must. Besides, it's his birthday, and we mean to make a batch of it." With that he went off, leaving her to solitude and her melancholy thoughts. She roused herself presently from these to send Sutton to pay Madame Laval's bill, and thought, as she gave the banknotes into her dresser's hand, how happy it would have made her only 4 days earlier to have been able to do this. She could still be thankful that she would not now be obliged to lay the debt before Cardross, but that seemed a very small alleviation of the ills that beset her. The sight of her dresser brought one of these most forcibly to her mind. It would be necessary to tell Sutton that the necklace was not in the hands of the Cardross jeweller, but indeed lost. And how to account for her own prevarication was a problem to which she could discover no answer. Letty might pour out her troubles to her maid. To Nell it was unthinkable that she should admit Sutton into her confidence. The thought of Letty made her ask Sutton suddenly where she was. The dresser replied that she believed her to have gone with Martha to Owen's in Bond Street to purchase fresh ribbons for the gown she meant to wear at Almack's that evening. She availed herself of the opportunity to inquire of Nell which gown she herself wished laid out in readiness, but Nell, who had forgotten the engagement, exclaimed, "Almack's? Oh, no, I cannot go there tonight." Sutton merely said, "Very well, my lady," and went away. Letty, if she had indeed arranged to meet her lover at the assembly rooms, would scarcely be so acquiescent. As the day drew towards 5 o'clock, Nell began to feel a little sick. Her spirits had been getting steadily lower for some time, and were not improved by the prospect beyond the window. The day had been dull, and the sky had now become so overcast that the drawing-room, which should have been full of sunshine, had put on a mournful twilight air. It even seemed to be a little chilly, but perhaps that was only her fancy. Cardross came in shortly after 5, but when Nell, bracing herself to face the ordeal in store, went downstairs, it was only to learn from the porter that his lordship was engaged with someone who had called to see him on a matter of business. Knowing that Cardross was dining out that evening, and feeling that her courage would be entirely dissipated if she were forced to remain on the rack for many more hours, she said, "It is very vexatious, for I particularly wish to speak with his lordship before he goes out again. Who is it who must come to see him on business at such an hour? Not Mr. Kent, surely?"
"No, my lady, it's a Mr. Catworth. He called this morning, and seeing as he said his business was private, which he wouldn't disclose to Mr. Kent nor anyone, I told him it was no manner of use for him to wait, because his lordship wasn't expected till 5. And back he came, my lady. But I would have put him in the office if I'd known your ladyship was wishful to see my lord, because my lord gave his orders when he come in just now, that when Sir John Somerby calls, he's to be taken to the library straight, my lady."
"And he may arrive at any moment, I dare say," Nell exclaimed. "George, if he should do so before this person who is now with his lordship has gone away, show him into the saloon, if you please, and desire him to wait, and inform his lordship that I wish to see him before he goes to Sir John."
"Yes, my lady, never fear,"
said George, in a reassuring tone that gave her clearly to understand that he had by this time realized that there was something unusual afoot.
I'll drop a word in Farley's ear, my lady."
She thanked him, flushing a little, and retreated again to the drawing-room, there to pass another miserable half-hour, wondering how much longer the obtrusive Mr. Catworth meant to linger, and why Providence, so falsely called merciful, had not seen fit to remove her from the world when, at the age of 5, she had contracted scarlet fever. And yet, when looking down from the window, she saw a neat individual descending the front steps, and knew that Cardross was at last at liberty, she at once wished that she might be granted just a few more minutes in which to recruit her forces. But if the dreaded interview were not to be postponed until the morrow, there was all too little time left to her. So she went quickly downstairs before a craven panic could wholly master her. George, his foot on the bottom stair, drew back, saying that he had been on the point of coming to tell her that his lordship was now alone, and ready to receive her. He went before her to hold open the door into the library. He would have liked to have said something encouraging to her, because she looked so young and so scared, and put him in mind of his daughter, but that, of course, was impossible. It was plain as a pikestaff she was in trouble, poor little thing. It was to be hoped his lordship would let her down easy, but he wasn't looking any too amiable. He was looking very far from amiable. The instant she had crossed the threshold, Nell knew that she had chosen her moment badly. He was standing beside his desk, his countenance very set, and he neither smiled nor moved forward to meet her. She had never before seen so sombre an expression in his eyes. Her own eyes dilated a little in sudden alarm. She said involuntarily, "Oh, what is it?" It was a moment or two before he spoke, and then he said in a very level tone, "I understand you particularly wish to speak to me. I am expecting a visit from Somerby, however, so unless the matter is of immediate importance, it would be better, perhaps, if this interview were postponed until the morning." The cold formality of this speech struck her to the heart. She was only just able to say, "It is of most immediate importance. I must tell you at once." "Very well. What is it?" It was not encouraging, but she could not draw back. She said, "The necklace, the Cardross necklace, it has gone." She thought he stiffened, but he did not speak. Frightened and perplexed, she stammered, "You don't... I think you cannot have understood me." "Oh, yes, I understood you," he said grimly. "Cardross, pray, you are very angry, shocked."
"Both. Too much to discuss it with you now. I will see you in the morning. I may be able to speak to you then with more moderation than is yet at my command."
"Oh, say what you wish to me, but don't look at me so," she begged. Indeed, I didn't lose it through any carelessness. It has been stolen, Cardross."
"I didn't suppose that you had mislaid it."
Are you suggesting that some thief contrived to enter the house without anyone's being aware of it, or do you mean to accuse one of the servants?
I don't know, but I am dreadfully afraid it must have been one of the servants, she said worriedly. They could have searched for it, but a stranger would not have known where to look, or surely have thought it necessary to make it seem as though no one had been to my rooms or stolen anything. I had no suspicion, you see. It might have been months before I discovered the loss, for it was hidden amongst clothes Sutton put away in camphor.
And how does it come about that you have discovered it? He asked. That is puzzling me a trifle, you know.
I didn't. It wasn't I who discovered it. Sutton found the case empty when she went to look over my winter clothes.
I see. How very disconcerting, to be sure.
There was a derisive note in his voice which made her stare at him in bewilderment.
Disconcerting, she repeated. Good God, it was far, far more than that, Cardross.
I'm sure you were excessively shocked. I collect that Sutton did not make this unwelcome discovery until today.
She did not answer him immediately. She had known that full confession would be difficult, but not that he would make it as difficult as this. She had to overcome an impulse to acquiesce, for it now seemed beyond her power to tell the whole of her tangled tale to this stranger, who watched her with such merciless eyes and spoke to her in so biting a tone. But the inward struggle lasted only for a minute. She drew a shuddering breath and said faintly, "No, I have known since Tuesday. I must explain to you, try to explain to you why I haven't told you until today."
"For God's sake, no! At least let me be spared that."
She was startled, for the words had burst from him with savage violence. Her eyes leapt to his, and she recoiled instinctively from the blaze of anger she saw there.
"Cardross!"
"Be silent!"
He flung round towards his desk and wrenched open one of its drawers.
"You need explain nothing to me, as you perceive."
She stood staring in utter amazement, almost unable to believe her eyes, for what he had taken from the drawer and tossed contemptuously onto the desk was the Cardross necklace. From a whirl of conjecture, nothing coherent emerged. She was so much at a loss that she could only gasp, "You have it?"
"Yes, Madam Wife, I have it," he replied.
Relief swept over her. "Oh, how thankful I am!" she cried. "But how? Why? I don't understand."
"Don't you? Then I will tell you," he said harshly. "It was brought to me not an hour ago by an astute little jeweller whose son, neither as astute nor, I fancy, as honest as himself, had bought it yesterday for the sum of £2,000. I imagine he must have blessed himself for his good fortune. It cannot be every day that such easy clients present themselves. We would be obliged to cut the necklace up, of course, but even so, it is worth a trifle more than 2,000, you know. No, you don't know, do you?" She hardly heard the bitter, jeering note in his voice, or grasped the implication of his words. She was staring at him with knit brows, rather pale, and with her breath coming short and light. "Yesterday?" she repeated. "Yesterday? Who? Did he tell you? Who?" His lips curled disdainfully. "No, he didn't tell me that. His fair client, understandably, one feels, was heavily veiled."
He caught the tiny sigh of relief that escaped her.
"Nor am I quite such a flat as to have wished for further information on that head," he said,
the savagery again rampant in his voice.
"A lady, unquestionably a lady, a young lady, dressed in the first stare of fashion, who would not disclose her name, how should she, indeed, or accept a banker's draft in payment. Do you suppose, when I had been told that I catechized Catworth?"
"Catworth," she said quickly. "The man who came to see you, came twice to see you, has just been with you." "Exactly so."
If only you had known. Is that what you are thinking, my sweet love? How should you have known? It was not he who bought the Cardross necklace for a song. You met the son. Quite a knowing one in his way, I should suppose, but by no means as downy as the father. If my new-found acquaintance is to be believed, he had never seen or heard of the Cardross necklace. Well, it may be so. I am much in debt to the father, and should be reluctant to disbelieve him. After all, I have never dealt with a Cranbourne Alley jeweller. Perhaps young Catworth is not fly, but green. It is otherwise with the elder Catworth. He recognized the necklace the instant it was shown him, and saw his duty clear before him. I must always regret that I was not just in the humour to enjoy the scene as it deserved to be enjoyed. So discreet he was, so virtuous. Not an ungentlemanly word spoken throughout. He did not even permit himself to hope for my future patronage, and he accepted without a blink every whisker that I uttered. An admirable man. I must certainly place a little business in his way. How very shabby it would be if I did not. He paused, but she did not speak or move. There was a queer, blank look in her eyes. Had he but known it, she was less concerned with the injustice of what he had said than with the realization of what must be the true story. He picked up the necklace and put it back in the drawer. Turning the key in the lock and removing it, he said sardonically, "You will forgive me, I trust, if henceforward I keep it in my own charge. I am persuaded you must, for you have never admired it or wished to wear it, have you? You should have discovered its worth, however, before you set out to dispose of it. I cannot have my wife so easily gulled, Lady Cardross." At that she blinked, and half lifted one hand in a beseeching gesture. "Ah, no, Giles. It did not move him. "Oh, don't waste your cajolery on me, my pretty one. You will catch cold at that now. I was a bigger flat than you, but believe me, the game is up. You hoaxed me wonderfully. Bowled me out with that sweet face and those innocent ways. I thought I was up to every move on the board, but when I saw you, when you put your hand in mine and looked up at me and smiled—" He broke off, and seemed to make an effort to master the rage that was consuming him. "You must pardon me. I had not meant to open my lips on this subject until I had had time to recover, in some sort, from the chagrin of having every suspicion forced on me during the few months of our marriage confirmed. Well, I have come by my deserts. I should have known better than to have been taken in by that lovely face of yours, or to have believed that under your charming manners you had a heart to be won. To be sure, you never gave me reason to think it, did you? How unjust of me to blame you for that. I will engage not to do so again, but must try to fulfill better my side of the bargain. It has been brought home to me how lamentably short of expectation I have fallen, but that can be mended and shall be. Tell me, my sweet life, at what figure do you set your beauty, your dutiful submission, your admirable discretion, and your unfailing politeness?" She had stood quite still, neither flinching from the ugly shafts aimed at her, nor making any further attempt to speak. She was very white, but although she heard what was being said to her, she hardly attended to it. He was saying such terrible things, but he did not know the truth. He was saying those things to some creature who did not exist, not to her. It hurt her that he could so misjudge her, but she never thought of blaming him. Just so had she misjudged Dysart, and with far less cause. "Well, why do you hesitate? Or don't you know what I am worth?" She looked at him and saw a stranger. She couldn't tell him all the truth while this black mood held him, much less disclose to him the shocking suspicion in her own heart. In the end he might have to know that too, but it was not certain yet. But if a worse disaster than he knew threatened him, there might still be yet time to avert it. Only she must not waste precious moments in trying to justify herself, or expose Dysart and Letty to the white heat of his anger. Later she would tell him, but not now, when her own part in the affair had suddenly become a matter of very little importance beside what might well prove to be Letty's.
She tried to speak, and found that she had too little command over her voice. He was still watching her with those hard, angry eyes. That hurt her, and made tears spring to her own. She winked them away, and managed to say, with a pathetic attempt at a smile wavering on her lips, "I can't answer you, you see. Later I will. Not now." She went rather blindly towards the door. His voice checked her, even startled her a little. "No, come back! I didn't mean it, Nell! I didn't mean it!" He took a quick stride towards her, only to be brought up short by the opening of the door and the entrance of his butler. "I beg your lordship's pardon," Farley said apologetically. "Well, what is it?" Cardross snapped. "I thought you would wish to know, my lord, that Sir John Somerby called to see your lordship 10 minutes ago. He is waiting in the saloon." "Tell him I will be with him presently." "No, please go to him now," Nell said gently, and left the room without again looking at him. She went swiftly up the stairs, past her own rooms, and up another flight to Letty's. Martha, running up 2 minutes later, in answer to the summons of a bell clanging so wildly that it was plain its pull had been tugged with peremptory vigour, found her standing in the middle of the room, and quailed under the sternly accusing look in her eyes.
"Oh, my lady, I didn't know it was your ladyship."
"Where is your mistress, Martha?" With the instinct of her kind to admit nothing, Martha said defensively,
"I'm sure I couldn't say, my lady."
"Indeed. Then will you come down, if you please, to his lordship?" Nell said calmly, gathering up her half-train and moving towards the door. This was enough to induce Martha, in a panic, to tell all she knew. It was not very much. She had indeed accompanied Letty to Bond Street that afternoon, where they had met Selina Thorne. Letty had sent her home then, saying that she would go with her cousin to Bryanston Square, and her aunt would convey her home later in her carriage. "Was Mrs. Thorne with Miss Selina?" Nell demanded.
"Oh, yes, my lady,"
Martha said, a little too glibly. "Did you see her?" Martha hesitated, but the unwavering blue gaze disconcerted her, and she muttered that Miss Selina had said she was in Hookham's. "I see. At what hour was this?"
I don't know, my lady, not to say precisely. It was when my Lord Dysart was with your ladyship that we stepped out."
"Lord Dysart left this house before 2 o'clock. It is now 6:30. But Lady Letitia hasn't returned, and you felt no anxiety?
I thought it was her ladyship that rang for me."
Nell's eyes swept the room. "But you have not laid out her ball dress?"
"Her ladyship said perhaps she should not go to the assembly, my lady. She said not to get in a pucker if she was late, or to say anything to anyone except that she was gone to Mrs. Thorne's, but she didn't tell me more. On my truth and honour she didn't, my lady."
"You must have known, however, that she didn't mean to return. No, don't tell me lies, if you please. Lady Letitia does not take her brushes and combs and her tooth-powder when she goes shopping." Martha burst into tears, sobbing that she had not known, that her ladyship had given her a parcel to carry, saying it contained some things she meant to give to Miss Selina. Yes, it was quite a large bundle, but she didn't know what was in it, and her ladyship had packed it herself and never told her. And she would happily lay down her life for her ladyship, particularly when the dear angel was being made so miserable as never was, and not a soul to turn to but one who had served her from the cradle, as it were. That will do. I think you have acted this part with the intention of doing your mistress a service, and did not mean to help her to do anything that would bring down the most dreadful consequences on her. But if she has indeed eloped, you will have done her the worst turn that lay in your power. I hope she has not. Indeed, I believe that Mr. Allendale has a greater regard for her reputation than you have shown. I don't know what I may be obliged to tell his lordship. That must depend on whether I can find her ladyship and bring her safely home, and also a little on your conduct now." The terrified Martha, eyes starting from her head and teeth chattering, began to gasp out promises of abject obedience, but Nell cut short her protestations, saying, "Stop crying and listen to me. I am going immediately to Mrs. Thorne's, and if I find your mistress there, or can discover from Miss Selina where she may have gone,
Perhaps no one need know what has taken place today. So you will not speak of this to anyone. Do you understand me? If you should be asked where I am, you must say that you don't know. Now go downstairs again and desire Sutton to come to my bedchamber, if you please. Sutton, entering her room 5 minutes later, in the expectation of helping her to change her dress, found her clad for the street in her bonnet and a light pelisse. Before she could give expression to her surprise, Nell said coolly, "Sutton, it is very vexatious, but I am obliged to go out. I don't know how long I may be." She raised her eyes from the gloves she was drawing over her fingers and said, "Perhaps you may guess my errand. I am persuaded I can rely on your discretion if that is so." "Your ladyship may always do so, but if, as I fancy is the case, you are going to find Lady Letitia, I beg you will permit me to accompany you." "Thank you. It is unnecessary, however. I have a particular reason for wishing you to remain here. I am very reluctant to let it be known to anyone, if Lady Letitia has done something foolish, which perhaps I may be able to mend." "I understand you perfectly, my lady. My lips shall be sealed, come what may," announced Sutton in prim accents, but with the resolute mien of one bound for the torture chamber. "Well, I don't think anything very dreadful will come of it," said Nell, smiling faintly. "His lordship doesn't dine at home tonight, so perhaps he will not inquire for me. But if he should do so, could you say that you suppose me to have gone out to dinner? He won't ask then where Lady Letitia is, because he will think she must be with me." "Certainly, my lady. He shall learn nothing from me." "I am very much obliged to you. One other thing. Can you, do you think, contrive to draw George out of the hall, so that he doesn't see me leave the house? He would think it odd, and perhaps talk of it, you know." "Very likely, my lady. I will step downstairs immediately, and desire him to fetch up your lady's dressing-case from the box-room," said Sutton with aplomb. "But what in the world should I want it for?" Nell objected. "That, my lady, is none of George's business," replied Sutton coldly. Whatever George may have thought, the ruse proved successful. There was no one in the hall to see Nell slip out of the house, and no one within earshot when she softly shut the front door behind her. She heaved a sigh of relief and set off quickly in the direction of the nearest hackney-coach stand. Chapter 13. Mrs. Thorne's butler, opening the door to Nell in time to see the hackney which had brought her to Bryanston Square move slowly away, was very much surprised that her ladyship would have deigned to enter such a lowly vehicle. But she had expected that he would be, and told him in the easiest way that her carriage had suffered a slight accident. He seemed satisfied with this explanation, but when she asked for his mistress, he was obliged to tell her that Madame had retired to her room to change her dress for dinner. "Then, if you please, be so good as to ask your mistress if I may go up to her," said Nell, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a lady of quality to arrive in a common hackney half an hour before dinner-time, wearing a morning dress, and coolly demanding to be taken up to her hostess's bedroom. The butler looked doubtful, but he went to deliver this message, returning almost immediately to beg her ladyship to step upstairs. Mrs. Thorne was seated before her dressing-table, enveloped in a voluminous wrapper, and with her hair only half pinned up in the elaborate fashion of her choice. She was a stout, good-natured-looking woman, and when she rose to greet Nell, she seemed rather to surge out of her chair. "Oh, my dear Lady Cardross, pray come in, and forgive my receiving you in such a way. But I would not keep you waiting while I scrambled on my clothes, and so I told Thomas to bring you to me straight away." "It's very kind of you. I should not be troubling you at such an awkward time," Nell said, shaking hands. "May I talk to you privately for a few minutes?" "Oh, my dear, yes, to be sure you may. Go and see if Miss Fanny is dressed yet, Betty. Set a chair for her ladyship before you go."
Do pray be seated, Lady Cardross." She herself sank back into the chair before the dressing-table, saying, almost before her maid was out of the room, "Tell me at once, my dear, when Thomas came to say that you were below, such a presentiment shot through me, and I can see by your face I was right." "I don't know. I hope not. Mrs. Thorne, has Letty been with you today?"
"Oh, my goodness gracious me," cried Mrs. Thorne, "if I didn't know it! No, my dear, I haven't seen Letty since she visited us last week. Don't tell me she has gone off with young Allendale. Wait, where are my smelling salts? Now tell me everything."
Clutching the vinaigrette and warding off a series of palpitations by frequently sniffing its aromatic contents, she managed to listen to the story Nell unfolded without succumbing to the various nervous ills which threatened to prostrate her. She was very much shocked, interrupting the tale with groans and horrified ejaculations. But there was nothing she could do to help Nell, because she knew nothing. She had never encouraged Mr. Allendale. Girls liked to flirt, and there was no harm in that, but when she had learned that Letty considered herself engaged to a young man without a penny to bless himself with, and no prospects worthy to be mentioned, she had never been more upset in her life. Nell was obliged to break in on her volubility, and to beg that Selina might be sent for. Mrs. Thorne was perfectly agreeable, but she could not think that Selina would be able to throw any light on the mystery of her cousin's whereabouts. When she was told of the meeting that afternoon in Bond Street, she could scarcely be brought to believe that such a thing could have happened.
"Selina? Going off to Bond Street? Oh, you don't mean it, Lady Cardross. I never heard of such a thing. To be sure, girls aren't kept so strict now as they were when I was young. Why, not a step outside the house could I take unless my mother or the governess was with me. Very irksome it was, I can tell you. I made up my mind I wouldn't use my girls so, and nor I have. But as for letting any of them go jauntering about town without one of her sisters or Betty to go with her, that would be quite beyond the line. Good gracious, whatever would people say? It doesn't bear thinking of. And if I find Martha was telling you the truth, which, however, it's very likely she wasn't, I declare Selina shall go to Miss Putnam's seminary, say what she will. It was what Mr. Thorne said she should do when Miss Woodbridge left us, but she pleaded so hard against it. Well, there. But that Martha would say anything. Depend upon it, my dear Lady Cardross, Selina knows no more than the man in the moon where her cousin may be. But when Selina presently came into the room, it was evident even to her fond parent that she knew very well why she had been sent for. She was in fine feather, and perfectly ready to be martyred in her cousin's cause. Hers had not been the chief role in the delightful drama, but she had been able easily to convince herself that without her self-abnegating offices, the interested parties would by this time have been obliged to resign themselves to their equally disagreeable fates. Letty, if she did not go into a decline and expire within the year, would have been ruthlessly forced into marriage with a titled Midas of evil disposition, at whose hands she would have suffered brutal ill usage, and Mr. Allendale, unaccountably forgotten by his superiors, would have worn out his life in a foreign land, always carrying his lost love's likeness next his heart, and dying, in circumstances of distressing neglect and anguish, with her name on his writhen lips. Until she found herself confronting Nell, of whom she stood in a great deal of awe, this affecting story had seemed to her so probable as to border on the inevitable. She had several times rehearsed the elevating utterances she would make if called upon to account for her actions, and in these scenes every effort made by Letty's persecutors to drag from her the secret of her whereabouts failed. Sometimes she remained mute while the storm raged over her devoted head, but in general she was extremely eloquent, expressing herself with such moving sincerity that even such worldly persons as her father and Lord Cardross
were often brought to see how false and mercenary were their ideas, and emerged from the encounter with changed hearts and the highest opinion of her fearlessness, nobility, and good sense. But in these scenes the other members of the cast spoke the lines laid down for them. In real life they said things so very different as to throw everything quite out of joint. In the event, Selina pronounced only one of her rehearsed speeches. Asked by her mother if she knew what had become of Letty, she clasped her hands at her breast and declined to answer the question. She then invited the two ladies to threaten her as much as they chose, to do with her what they would, but warned them that they would find it impossible to force her to betray her cousin. Mrs. Thorne should then have conjured her daughter on her obedience to divulge the truth. Instead, and with a lamentable lack of histrionic ability, she begged her irritably not, for goodness sake, to start any of her play-acting. And before Selina could recover from this setback, Nell completed her discomfiture by saying in a tone of grave reproof, "Indeed, Selina, you must not make believe over this, for I am afraid it is much more serious than you have any idea of." After that, there could be no recapturing the dramatic flavour of the piece. Selina did say that she wouldn't tell anything, but even in her own ears this sounded very much more sulky than noble. And when Mrs. Thorne, heaving herself out of her chair, declared her intention of hailing her immediately before her papa, who would know how to deal with such impertinence, instead of behaving like a heroine, she collapsed into frightened tears. It took a little time to drag the whole story out of her, and the effect of her revelations on Mrs. Thorne was severe enough to make Nell feel profoundly sorry for the poor lady. She was so much stunned by the discovery that when she had believed Selina to have gone under the escort of her maid to a dancing class or a music lesson, that abandoned damsel had been setting forth by stealth for the most fashionable quarter of the town alone, and for the purpose of aiding and abetting her cousin in conduct that, if it were to become known, would disgrace them both for ever in the eyes of all persons of ton, that she could do nothing but reproach Selina, and wonder how she came to have a daughter so lost to all sense of propriety. It was left to Nell to question Selina, which she did with a gentle coldness that overawed her far more than did her mother's scoldings.
Letty had sold the necklace to Catworth on the day that she had gone with her cousin to choose a wedding gift for Fanny. They had dismissed the carriage outside the Pantheon, telling the coachman to call for them at Gunter's in Berkeley Square considerably later in the day. After purchasing a couple of thick veils, they had set out in a hack for Cranbourne Alley, having discovered the existence of the firm of Catworth and Son through the simple expedient of asking the jarvey on the box to recommend them a jeweller not patronized by persons of quality. While Letty had transacted her business with the younger Catworth, Selina had remained in the hack because the jarvey, when instructed to wait outside the shop, apparently suspecting them of trying to give him the slip, had expressed a strong wish of being paid off then and there. After the sale of the necklace, only one thing was needed for an elopement, and that was the bridegroom, who was then still out of town. At this point, Mrs. Thorne exclaimed,
"Never tell me Allendale was ready to take her with no more than £2,000.
"My dear ma'am, you cannot suppose that Mr. Allendale was a party to such a thing," Nell said.
"No, he wasn't," corroborated Selina. "Letty said she would tell him she had it from her godfather, in case he should think she ought not to have taken the necklace."
The two girls had met that afternoon by pre-arrangement, and as soon as Martha had been got rid of, which was done because Letty wished, with rare consideration, to protect her from blame, they had purchased such necessities as Letty had been unable to pack in her bundle, and brought them to Bryanston Square, to be bestowed in an old cloak-bag belonging to Papa. Finally, Letty had departed in a hackney for Mr. Allendale's lodging in Ryder Street.
"But you won't catch them," Selina said with a last flicker of defiance, "because that was hours ago, and you may depend upon it they are many miles away by now."
This seemed all too probable to Mrs. Thorne, sinking back in her chair with a groan of dismay, but Nell was more hopeful. When Selina had been dismissed to bed, with the promise of bread and water for her supper, an interview with Papa on the morrow, and incarceration for an unspecified length of time in a Bath seminary for young ladies, she rose to her feet, saying that she would go at once to Ryder Street.
"But what is the use, my dear?" wailed Mrs. Thorne. "You heard what that wicked child of mine said. They are off to Gretna Green, depend upon it."
"I cannot credit it. No doubt that was Letty's plan, but I shall own myself astonished if it was Mr. Allendale's. Oh, he would not do such a thing. I am quite confident he would not."
"Good gracious, Lady Cardross, where else could they go? They couldn't be married in England, what with Letty's being under age and special licenses and I don't know what beside. Surely to goodness he wouldn't have let her run away to him if he didn't mean to marry her immediately."
"I don't believe he knew anything about it," declared Nell. "Only consider, ma'am. He is a respectable man of superior sense, with extremely nice notions of propriety. I am persuaded he would not entertain for an instant the thought of eloping with a child of Letty's age. Her expectations, too. Oh, no, he couldn't do it. If his own good feeling did not prevent him, the knowledge that he would be thought to have behaved like a most unprincipled fortune-hunter surely would."
"Aye, there is that," agreed Mrs. Thorne, a little doubtfully. "He would lose his employment, too, I dare say. But you know, my dear, when a man falls head over ears in love, there's no saying what he may do. And you aren't going to tell me Letty ran off to elope with him without him knowing she meant to do it?"
"Yes, I am," Nell said, on a tiny choke of laughter.
"It would be exactly like her to do so." "Well," gasped Mrs. Thorne, "of all the brazen little hussies! A nice surprise it will be for Allendale when he goes home from the Foreign Office, thinking of nothing but his dinner, as I don't doubt he will be, and finds that naughty girl in his lodging as bold as brass, and expecting him to set out with her for Scotland. Well, I hope it will be a lesson to him, that's all. Only if that's the way it was, why didn't he bring her back to you long since?"
"I've thought of that," Nell said. "It does seem strange, but if he were kept late at his work, then, too, it would take him a little time, you know, to persuade Letty to give up the scheme. In fact, the likeliest chance is that she fell into one of her hysterical fits of crying, and the poor man could not have the least notion how to stop her. Oh, I must go to Ryder Street at once." The conviction that she would arrive at Mr. Allendale's lodging to find him endeavouring to soothe his would-be bride grew steadily upon Nell as she was bounced and jolted there in yet another hack, and she began to be quite buoyant again, feeling that if she could only restore his sister to Cardross with her reputation unblemished, she would have done much to atone for the follies and extravagances of the past weeks. But when the hackney turned out of St. James's Street into Ryder Street, she suffered a check. The coachman pulled up his aged horse, and clambered down from the box to discover what was the number of the house she wished to visit, and it suddenly occurred to Nell that she didn't know it, nor did the coachman. Asked if he was perhaps familiar with Mr. Allendale, he said he wasn't one to bother his head over the names of gentlemen who patronized him, and surveyed his fair passenger with unwelcome interest. She was put a little out of countenance by this, and had, indeed, been feeling a trifle uneasy from the moment the hack turned into St. James's Street, and she had seen all the club's windows lighted up, and several gentlemen of her acquaintance strolling along the flagway. This quarter of fashionable London, which lay between Pall Mall and Piccadilly, belonged almost exclusively to the gentlemen, and it was not considered good ton for a lady to be seen within its bounds. Nearly all the clubs were to be found in St. James's Street, and the streets which led from it abounded in bachelor lodgings and gaming hells. The coachman was plainly wondering whether he had been mistaken in the social status of his fare, and Nell was beginning to feel rather helpless and extremely uncomfortable when she providentially remembered that Mr. Hethersett also lived in Ryder Street, and would no doubt be able to direct her to Mr. Allendale's abode, if she were fortunate enough to find him at home. So she told the coachman to drive her to number 5. It did not seem probable that Mr. Heatherset would be at home, for it was now past 8 o'clock, but fortune favoured her. Just as she was searching in her reticule for her purse, the door of number 5 opened, and Mr. Heatherset himself came out of the house, very natty in knee-breeches and silk stockings, and a waistcoat of watered silk, a swallow-tailed coat, and a snowy cravat arranged by his expert hands in the intricate style known as the mathematical tie. Set at a slight angle on his oiled locks was an elegant chapeau bras, and hanging from his shoulders was a silk-lined cloak. He carried a pair of gloves in one hand and an ebony cane in the other, but perceiving the unusual spectacle of a lady engaged in paying off a hackney coachman at his very door, he transferred the gloves to his right hand, so that he could raise to one eye the quizzing-glass that was slung about his neck. At just this moment, Nell turned to mount the few steps to his door, and uttered a joyful exclamation.
"Felix! Oh, how glad I am to have caught you!"
The jarvey, observing that the expression on Mr. Heatherset's face was of profound dismay, clicked his tongue disapprovingly. In his view, Nell, as dimber a mort as he had clapped eyes on in a 12-month, was worthy of a warmer greeting than the startled "Good God!" which broke from Mr. Heatherset.
"What the deuce brings you here?" demanded Mr. Heatherset, alarmed out of his usual address. "Cardross hasn't met with an accident, has he? Or—"
"Oh, no, nothing like that," she assured him. "I shan't keep you above a moment. Are you on your way to a party? But I have most stupidly forgotten the number of the house Mr. Allendale lodges in."
Disappointed in this conversation, the jarvey adjured his lethargic steed to get up, and drove slowly off.
"Thank the Lord he's gone," said Mr. Heatherset. "You know, cousin, you shouldn't be driving about in a hack and coming here to ask me for Allendale's direction. I mean, not my business, but it ain't at all the thing. Cardross wouldn't like it. Besides, what do you want with Allendale?"
"Well, that isn't your business either," Nell pointed out. "And if Cardross knew I was here, he would not have the least objection, I assure you, for I am here for a very sufficient purpose. So will you, if you please, tell me the number of Mr. Allendale's lodging, and then you may go to your party, and not trouble your head over me any more."
"No," said Mr. Heatherset, with unexpected firmness, "I won't. Well, I should be bound to trouble my head over you, stands to reason. Because it seems to me you're up to something dashed smoky, cousin, and as for saying Cardross wouldn't object to your paying calls in a hack at this time of day, well, if that's what you think, you can't know him. What I'm going to do is take you home."
"No, you are not," said Nell indignantly. "Now, Felix, just because you met me in Clarges Street that day does not give you the right to try and bully and hector me over this."
"Never mind that. By the by, I hope all's right about that business."
Yes, Dysart settled it for me."
"He did he?"
"Yes, for he has won a great deal of money on a horse called Cockroach. It was not very handsome of you to have betrayed me to him, however."
"No, I know it wasn't. Best thing I could think of, though. What we want now is another hack."
"No, though I hope it is what I may want in a very little time. I suppose I shall be obliged to tell you what has happened," she sighed.
"Good God, cousin, do you take me for a flat?" demanded Mr. Heatherset. "If you're searching all over for Allendale, it means that Letty is up to her tricks. What's she done? Eloped with the fellow?"
"I very much fear it."
"Eh?"
he said incredulously.
No, not the sort of fellow to do a scaly thing like that. I was only funning."
But when he had heard all that Nell saw fit to tell him of the day's events, he looked a good deal taken aback, and acknowledged that the affair bore all the appearance of an uncommonly rum set-out.
"What's more, if Allendale's made off with her— Yes, but dash it, cousin, that won't fadge. I mean, it wouldn't be up to the rig, and though I can't say I like him above half, there's nothing of the queer nab about him."
"No, indeed, and that is what makes me very hopeful of finding them still here," she explained. "So pray, will you direct me to the house?"
"Yes, but where's Cardross?" he demanded. "He can't have gone out of town again because I saw him at White's this afternoon. It's his business to find Letty, not yours.
He is dining out tonight, and then, too, he had Sir John Somerby with him, you see."
"What you mean," said Mr. Heatherset severely, "is that you haven't told him."
"No," she confessed, I haven't."
"Well, you ought to have done so. Very unwilling to offend your cousin, but you got no right to play the concave suit with Cardross over that chit. Dash it, she's his ward. Dessay you're fond of her, but it won't do to be hoaxing Giles about today's business."
"No," she agreed. "Indeed, I don't mean to, Felix, only the thing is that he is very much vexed today. Something occurred that put him sadly out of temper, and I particularly don't wish to be obliged to break this news to him when perhaps he would be quite dreadfully angry with Letty."
"Good thing if he was," said Mr. Heatherset unfeelingly. "If you want to know what I think, it's my belief that the sooner you're rid of that Resty girl, the better it will be. Unsteady, that's what she is. Maggoty, too. Never know where to take her, or what she'll be up to next."
He glanced fleetingly at Nell, but it had grown rather too dark for him to be able to see her face clearly. However, he had drawn certain conclusions which he was pretty sure were accurate, so he added in a careless way,
"Shouldn't be surprised if it was her starts that had put him out of temper."
Nell said nothing in reply to this. The lamplighter was coming down the street, with his ladder carried between him and the boy, who followed at his heels. Nell, who was tired of standing outside Mr. Heatherset's house, pointed this circumstance out to him, saying, "Won't he think it excessively odd that we should be standing here?"
"Yes, but we ain't going to stand here," replied Mr. Heatherset. "It don't look to me as though Allendale's at home, but you may as well inquire for him."
"Do you mean to say that he lives next door to you?" demanded Nell.
"Yes. There's no reason why he shouldn't," said Mr. Heatherset, surprised at the indignant note in her voice. "What I mean is, he don't trouble me. I hardly ever see him."
"And you have kept me standing outside all this time. It is a great deal too bad of you," said Nell, treading up the steps to the door and grasping the heavy brass knocker.
"I was trying to think what I should do with you while I did the trick here. Trouble is, there ain't anywhere for you to go. But you oughtn't to be asking for Allendale, you know. Leave it to me, cousin."
She was quite ready to do this, but when the door was opened, and Mr. Heatherset asked the proprietor of the establishment if Mr. Allendale was at home, and was told that he was not, he seemed so much inclined to withdraw without pursuing his inquiries any farther, that she felt obliged to intervene. Disregarding a horrified murmur of protest from Mr. Heatherset, she boldly asked if Mr. Allendale had gone out alone or accompanied by a lady.
"Would it be Mr. Allendale's sister you was referring to, ma'am?" asked the man cautiously.
"Yes," said Nell, with great promptness.
"Ah,"
said the proprietor, stroking his chin in a ruminative way.
"That's what he said, I don't deny, but it wasn't what she said, which puts me in a fix, in a manner of speaking, because if it was his sister you was wishful to see, I couldn't say it was her as was here today, not to take my oath on it, I couldn't. The young party as came here asking for Mr. Allendale told Mrs. Shotwig, which is my good lady, as how she was engaged to be married to him, which is different."
"Well, that is the lady I wish to find," said Nell.
"Ah,"
said Mr. Shotwig, still caressing his chin.
"I've no objection, but the question is, can you, ma'am? Because she ain't here, nor hasn't been, these 3 hours and more. Which I'm just as glad she hasn't, on account of all the bobbery there was."
"Oh, dear," Nell said, her heart sinking. What sort of bobbery?"
"Now, dash it, cousin," expostulated Mr. Heatherset, by this time in a state of acute discomfort.
At this point, Mr. Shotwig was struck by the happy idea of inviting them to step inside, so that they might discuss the delicate matter with the mistress of the establishment. Nell readily agreed to this, Mr. Heatherset not so readily, and they were ushered into Mr. Allendale's parlour on the right of the front door, and left there while Mr. Shotwig went off to summon his wife onto the scene. "Oh, Felix, what can have happened?" Nell said. "Gone for more than 3 hours. When that man said they were not here, I thought at first that perhaps Mr. Allendale had taken Letty home, and I should find her there when I returned. But 3 hours! Where can she be if they have not eloped together?
I don't know where she can be, said Mr. Heatherset. I know where we are, however, and it ain't where I want to be. I'm dashed sure this fellow knows who I am, and the next thing we shall find is that he's twigged who you are. It'll be all over town before the cat's had time to lick her ear.
Well, if you don't like to be seen in my company, you may go away, said Nell with spirit.
I don't, said Mr. Heatherset frankly, particularly in this rig when you ain't dressed for the evening. Not at all the thing, looks dashed peculiar. We shall have all the quizzes wondering what the deuce we were doing. Can't tell 'em we were looking all over for Letty.
Anxious as she was, she could not help laughing at this. She said mischievously, "It is very bad, but your credit is so good that I am persuaded no one would believe for an instant that you had done anything that was not good ton."
"Yes, but this is no time for funning, my dear Lady Cardross. Besides, there's no saying what people will believe. The thing is, we're going the quickest way to work to get it said about that wretched girl has gone clean beyond the line. What's more, Cardross will be as mad as fire with the pair of us for making cakes of ourselves, instead of telling him what had happened."
She felt that this indeed might be true, but before she could reply, Mr. Shotwick had come back, with a stout dame in a mob-cap, whom he introduced as his good lady. From the somewhat involved story that issued from Mrs. Shotwick's lips, it became apparent that the eruption of Letty into her hitherto ordered existence had disarranged her mind quite as much as it had shaken her faith in her favourite lodger.
"For not to deceive you, ma'am, what to think I did not know nor don't."
Her first impulse, on learning from her spouse that a beautiful young lady with a cloak-bag had taken possession of Mr. Allendale's parlour with the expressed intention of remaining there until he returned to his lodging, had been to eject so bold a hussy immediately. But when she had sailed into the room to accomplish this desirable object, she had suffered a check. She beheld quality, and one did not turn quality out of one's house, however respectable one might be. But she had been on the watch for Mr. Allendale, and she had waylaid him on his entering the house, and given him to understand that goings-on under her roof she would not allow. It had struck her forcibly that upon hearing of his betrothed's presence in his parlour, he had looked queer, to put it no higher.
"Queer as Dick's hatband," corroborated Mr. Shotwick. "I should think he dashed well would look queer," said Mr. Heatherset, impatient of this circumstantial history. "Ah," said Mr. Shotwick, "specially if he was trying to tip her the double, which was what we suspicioned, sir."
"I'll thank you not to use that nasty cant, Shotwick," said the wife of his bosom, sharply. "No such thought crossed my mind, not then it didn't."
"Not till the kick-up started," agreed Mr. Shotwick. "Lor, how she did take on! I thought we should have the neighbours in on us." He shook his head mournfully. "You couldn't help but compassionate her. But what has me fair flummoxed is the way he slum-guzzled us, because the quieter, nicer behaved gentleman you couldn't find, not if you was to look from here to Jericho. But he tipped her the rise, no question."
"That'll do," said his wife.
She looked significantly at Nell and said darkly,
"Not a word shall pass my lips with a gentleman present, but I ask you, ma'am, what is anyone to think when a sweet, pretty young thing carries on like she was desperate, and begs and implores a gentleman, if such you can call him, to marry her?"
"Crying 5 loaves a penny, in course," said Mr. Shotwick, helpfully. "Yes, never mind that. What I mean is, no such thing," intervened Mr. Heatherset, devoutly trusting that this expression was unknown to Nell. Not that there was any chance she hadn't understood the gist of Mrs. Shotwick's remarks. She was looking aghast, as well she might.
"All I want to know is, did they leave this house together, and did you hear where they were bound for?"
"That I cannot say," replied Mrs. Shotwick.
Leave it they did, in a post-chaise and pair.
A post-chaise, Nell echoed in a hollow voice. A post-chaise it was, ma'am, as I saw with my own eyes, and which Mr. Allendale stepped out to bespeak his own self, nodded Mrs. Shotwick. And this I will say. Whatever he's done, he means to do right by that poor young thing now, for when I asked him what was to be done, he answered me straight out there was only one thing he could do. I don't say he looked like he wanted to, but he was very resolute, oh, very resolute he was. He didn't say anything more to me, but turned sharp about and came back into this very room where Miss was laid down on that sofa, looking that wore out as never was. But what he said to her I don't know, for he shut the door. All I know is that whatever it was, he'd had her up off the sofa in a twinkling and as happy as a grig. And then he went off to hire a chaise, and Miss called to me to help her pack his valise, and not another tear did she shed. No need to worry about her, then, said Mr. Heatherset, making the best of a bad business. Much obliged to you. He then requested Mr. Shotwick to step out in search of a hack, and cast an uneasy glance at Nell. She was looking quite stricken, but, to his relief, she did not speak until Mrs. Shotwick had curtsied herself out of the room. He said curtly, "Going to take you home. Nothing to be done. It's too late. Very scabby conduct of Allendale's, but I'm bound to say I'm dashed sorry for him."
"Oh, could he not have brought her back to home?" Nell cried, wringing her hands.
"Not if she was screeching in hysterics," said Mr. Heatherset, with considerable feeling. "What's more, I don't blame him."
"I blame myself. If I had told Cardross of my suspicion, he might have been able then to have overtaken them. But now I was so certain Mr. Allendale would not. I thought I should be able to set the wretched business to rights, but I have only helped to ruin Letty."
"Don't see that at all," he replied. "Plenty of time for Cardross to catch him if he wants to. Only travelling with a pair of horses wouldn't make much difference if they had 4. Give Cardross his curricle and 4 good uns, and I'd back him over the distance if they'd twice as long a start of him. You ever seen Giles with a 4 in hand? Well, he's top of the trees, I give you my word. Knows how to keep strange horses together, too."
"Oh, do you think they could still be overtaken?" she said.
"Lord, yes. All we have to do... Now, what is it?"
She had uttered a chagrined, "Oh!" and she now said, "Cardross is not at home. He was dining out, and I don't know where."
"No need to get into a taking over that," replied Mr. Heatherset calmly. "Farley will know." This made her feel rather more cheerful, and upon Mr. Shotwick's coming back to announce that a hack was waiting to take them up, she started up, begging Mr. Heatherset to make haste. There was certainly a hack standing in the street, a large and dilapidated vehicle, whose body, hanging drunkenly between 2 old-fashioned perches, showed, by tarnished silverwork and an almost obliterated coat of arms, that it had descended a long way in the social scale since the days when, with a powdered coachman on the box and 2 knights of the rainbow standing up behind, it had been the town chariot of a nobleman. It was not at all the kind of carriage any person of fashion would now choose to ride in, but Nell and Mr. Heatherset, emerging from the house, found that their temporary possession of it was not to be undisputed. 2 gentlemen were arguing with the jarvey on their right to claim it, and this worthy man had apparently found it necessary to come down from the box to preserve it from invasion. Mr. Heatherset, after one glance, tried to obscure the scene from Nell's view, saying tersely, "Better step inside again till I've got rid of them."
"But it's Dysart," said Nell.
"Yes, I know it is, but we haven't any time to stand talking to him," said Mr. Heatherset.
"No, of course not, but he's trying to hire our hackney, and he must not," said Nell, trying to push him out of the way.
"For the Lord's sake, cousin, go back into the house," begged Mr. Heatherset. "He ain't alone."
"No, but the other is only Mr. Fancourt, and I think," Nell said knowledgeably, "that they are both of them a trifle foxed. Dysart—"
The Viscount, upon hearing himself addressed, turned. The light from the nearby street lamp enabled him quite plainly to recognize his sister, but he knew better than to trust his eyes when he was, in his own estimation, a little above par. He called upon his companion for assistance. "Corney, that ain't my sister Cardross, is it?" "No," said Mr. Fancourt obligingly. "What a horrid creature you are, Di," remarked Nell, descending the steps. "You cannot drive off in that coach, because it was brought for me, and I must have it. I am in the greatest haste, so do pray stop disputing with that poor man and go away." "B'God, it is my sister Cardross!" exclaimed the Viscount, thunderstruck. "Yes," agreed Mr. Fancourt, smiling vaguely, but with immense affability, at Nell. "Well, there's no need to shout it all down the street," said Mr. Heatherset tartly. The Viscount looked intently at him, while he wrestled silently with the problem. "It's you, is it?" he said, a certain kindling in his eyes and a brooding note in his voice. "You? And my sister?" Mr. Heatherset, who had foreseen from the start that something like this would happen, said soothingly, "Escorting her ladyship home." "Oh, well, were you?" said the Viscount, showing signs of rising choler. "We'll see that, because it seems to me... Corney, where are we?" "Watier's," said Mr. Fancourt after a moment's thought. "No, we ain't," said his lordship, irritated. "Going to Watier's," amended Mr. Fancourt. "I'll tell you where we are," announced the Viscount in menacing accents. "We're in Ryder Street." "That's right, sir, Ryder Street it is," said the Jarvey encouragingly. "You don't want no hack to take you to Watier's." "Ryder Street," said the Viscount. "Now I know whose house you were coming out of. Now I know what made you take such an uncommon interest in my sister's affairs. By God, if I don't cut your liver out for this—" "That's for you, my girl, that'll do," interrupted Mr. Heatherset. "You can cut my liver out in the morning, but for the Lord's sake stop making such a damned kick-up in the street." "Not liver," said Mr. Fancourt positively, his wandering attention recalled by this word. "Duck. That's what we said, Di. Got a way of cooking it at Watier's I like." "Well, you take Dice out there," recommended Mr. Heatherset. "He can take him, but he won't never get him past the porter, governor, not as lushy as what they both are," observed the Jarvey sapiently. "Yes, I will," said Mr. Fancourt. "It's my birthday." "Get into the hack," Mr. Heatherset said to Nell. "No, not you." Mr. Fancourt, hauled off the step of the coach by the Jarvey, called upon the Viscount to come and give this individual one in the bread-basket, but the Viscount had more important matters to attend to. Addressing himself to Mr. Heatherset, he commanded that harassed exquisite to name his friends. Alarmed by this evident intention to force a quarrel on to Mr. Heatherset, Nell laid a hand on his arm and said, "Di, pray don't be so goosish. You quite mistake the matter, you know. Indeed, it is abominable of you to think such horrid things, besides being excessively embarrassing." "Don't you try to bamboozle me," replied her brother, shaking off her hand. "Are you going to name your friends, sir, or are you not?" "You wouldn't remember 'em if I did. What you need is a damper. You're as drunk as a brewer's horse." "Oh, no, I'm not. I'll tell you what you are. A damned loose fish, a regular hedge-bird, a mad milliner, by God, cow-hearted. If you ain't stale drunk in the morning, come round to my place, and I'll dashed well show you how cow-hearted I am," promised Mr. Heatherset, stung by these opprobrious terms. "It'll be bellows to mend with you, what's more. I've seen you sport your canvas at Jackson's, and when it comes to handy blows, you ain't any better than a moulder." "Now, by God!" ejaculated the Viscount, squaring up to him. The Jarvey called out approvingly, "A mill! A mill!"
Nell flung herself between the two incensed gentlemen, and Mr. Fancourt, who had been standing wrapped in thought, suddenly announced his intention of driving to Watier's in the hack, and disappeared round the back of the coach. "Dysart, how dare you be so uncivil?" Nell said hotly. "Pray don't heed him, Felix. I was never so mortified. Dysart, if you say another word to Felix—"
"It don't signify," interrupted Mr. Heatherset, who had had time to recollect the impropriety of engaging in fisticuffs in a lady's presence. "Forgot myself." He looked at the Viscount. "If you want to fight, you can tell me so tomorrow. I'm going to escort her ladyship home now." "Oh, no, you ain't," retorted the Viscount. "I am going to take her home. Yes, and I'm dashed well going to tell Cardross what sort of May game you've been playing, my buck."
"Oh, dear, what are we to do?" said Nell distractedly. "Felix, there are a couple of men coming towards us."
"Good God, there's nothing for it. We shall have to take him along with us. Get into the hack, cousin."
"Take him with us? But if Cardross sees him in this shocking state—"
"Lord Giles knows what he is," said Mr. Heatherset impatiently.
"Good heavens!" said Nell rather faintly. "Then that must have been what he meant. How very dreadful!"
"Here, wait a bit," suddenly said the Viscount. "Where's Corney? Can't leave Corney behind. It's his birthday."
"Well, thank goodness he has gone at least," said Nell, as Mr. Heatherset handed her up into the coach. "If only we could persuade Di—" "Oh! Good God, what's the matter?" demanded Mr. Heatherset, as she recoiled from the vehicle. "He hasn't gone," said Nell despairingly. "He's inside. I think he's fallen asleep."
"Well, I'll be gormed!" exclaimed the Jarvey, peering into the coach. "He must have crope around when I wasn't a-watching of him and got in by t'other door. Now we'll have to haul him out again."
"No, no, pray don't," begged Nell, hurriedly getting into the coach. "Only let us go away from here."
"But I can't let you drive about the town with a couple of ensign-bearers," expostulated Mr. Heatherset. "Oh, my God, if it ain't Bottisham bearing down on us! Well, that settles it. We can't stay here another moment. Here, Dysart, stop looking for Fancourt under the hack. He's in it."
With this, he thrust the Viscount into the coach, gave a hurried direction to the Jarvey, climbed into the coach himself, and slammed the door. Chapter 14. It seemed at first as though the drive to Grosvenor Square was to be enlivened by a brawl, for although the Viscount's mind had been diverted by the loss of his friend, this aberration was but of short duration. No sooner had he satisfied himself that Mr. Fancourt was still with them, than he discovered Mr. Heatherset was also with them, and took instant exception to his presence. However, before he could attempt to carry out his promise to throw him out, Mr. Fancourt, roused by the jolting of the wheels over the cobblestones, woke up and demanded to know where he was.
"Never mind that," said the Viscount. "Here's this cursed fellow Heatherset's got in with us. Help me to throw him out, will you?" "Oh, I can't do that," said Mr. Fancourt, who was filled with a large tolerance. "A very good sort of man. Didn't know I'd invited him, and is very glad he came." "You didn't invite him. Nobody invited him," said the Viscount. "Must have," said Mr. Fancourt. "Wouldn't have come if I hadn't. Polite to a point. Happy to take a glass of wine with him." "Well, if I ever saw Corney so cast away," exclaimed Dysart. "Dashed if he ain't as drunk as a wheelbarrow."
"Yes, but at least he's perfectly amiable," said Nell. "He doesn't say outrageous things or try to throw people into the street." This unfortunate remark reminded the Viscount that his purpose was still unaccomplished, but just at that moment Mr. Fancourt began to warble an entirely unintelligible ditty.
Since he was apparently afflicted with tone deafness, this musical interlude was a severe trial to the rest of the company, and caused the Viscount to forget Mr. Heatherset again. "Stop it, Corny," he said indignantly. "Chip, chip, cherry chip, fo-diddly-doo," sang Mr. Fancourt. "That's not right," said Dysart scornfully. "It don't even make sense." He then upraised his powerful baritone, and favoured the company with the correct version, which, as far as his sister could discover, differed hardly at all from his friend's. But Mr. Heatherset, unmoved by Mr. Fancourt's outburst, was powerfully affected by the Viscount's. No sooner did the refrain of "Chip chow, cherry chow, folol de riddle low" break upon his ears than Nell felt him stiffen, and heard him utter an exclamation under his breath. The Viscount beguiled the rest of the way with song, and was still singing when Cardross's astonished butler admitted the party into the house. But it did not appear to be Lord Dysart's condition that surprised Farley. It was the sight of his mistress that made his eyes widen. He exclaimed involuntarily, "My lady!" "Yes, did you not know that I had been obliged to go out?" said Nell, with an attempt to carry the situation off unconcernedly. "Pray show Lord Dysart and Mr. Fancourt into the library. They have come to take supper with me." "My birthday," said Mr. Fancourt affably. "Celebrating it. Black Beetle, too." "I see, sir," responded Farley, gently removing the hat from his grasp. "Black Beetle be damned," said the Viscount. "Cockroach! Where's his lordship?" "His lordship is not at home, but he will be in directly, my lord," replied Farley, consigning the visitors into the care of the footman who had followed him into the hall. Mr. Fancourt was easily shepherded into the library, but the Viscount was recalcitrant. "It ain't a bit of use trying to fob me off," he told his sister sternly. "I'm not letting you out of my sight, Nell, so don't think it. Not with that fellow in the house."
"Dysart, for heaven's sake!"
"You'd better go with him, cousin," advised Mr. Heatherset. "No sense in starting him off again on his high ropes. Much better leave this to me." Since Dysart had acquired a firm grip on her arm, there really seemed to be nothing else she could do, so, with a low-voiced entreaty to Mr. Heatherset to lose no time in setting forth in search of Cardross, she retired to the library. Here she was made welcome by Mr. Fancourt, happy in the belief that he was entertaining friends under his own roof. He shook her warmly by the hand, and offered her a glass of wine. She declined this, which distressed him, but Dysart, who had discovered glasses and a decanter set out on a side table, said, "No use pressing her. Only 2 glasses." Mr. Fancourt was shocked. "Only 2 glasses?" he repeated. "That's absurd, Di. No other word for it. Absurd. Stupid fellow, I misunderstood. Ring for more glasses." "We don't need any more glasses," replied Dysart, lavishly pouring wine into the 2 that stood on the table. "Yes, we do," insisted Mr. Fancourt. "Can't give a party with 2 glasses. Stands to reason." "Well, it ain't a party. It ain't your house, either." "It ain't?" Mr. Fancourt said incredulously. He subjected his surroundings to a keen, if somewhat owlish, scrutiny. "By Jove, Di, so it ain't. Dashed if I know whose house it is. You know what, dear boy? We've come to the wrong house. Better go." "No, we haven't. Come here to see Cardross," said Dysart, with a darkling look. Mr. Fancourt thought this over profoundly. "No," he pronounced at last. "Not sure why we came here, but we don't want to see Cardross. Nothing against him, mind. Not particularly acquainted with him. A capital fellow. Bang up to the mark. Honoured to meet him, but the thing is, not what we set out to do. Tell me this, Di. Have we dined?" "To hell with dinner. I'm going to see Cardross," said Dysart obstinately.
"Oh, Dysart, I wish you will go away," Nell exclaimed. "You don't want to meet Cardross, you know you don't." "That's what I said," nodded Mr. Fancourt, gratified. "Not what we set out to do. Besides, he ain't here. Go to Wattier's." "Not till I've seen Cardross. I've got something to say to him. No business to let that fellow dangle after my sister. I'm going to tell him so." "Which fellow?" inquired Mr. Fancourt. "Heatherset," replied the Viscount, tossing off the wine in his glass. "You know what he is, Corny? A damned man of the town. And there's Cardross letting him make up to my sister while he goes off like a regular care for nobody. What I say is, he's got no business to neglect her, and so I shall tell him." "He doesn't neglect me," said Nell hotly, "and if you were not so odiously foxed, Di, you wouldn't say such detestable things." "Yes, I should," he retorted. "In fact, the more I think of it, the more I can see he's too high in the instep by half. Took a pet because I held you up. Very well. If he didn't want me to hold you up, why didn't he do it himself? Tell me that. Who brought the dibs in tune for you? I did. Who stopped you getting into Duke King's clutches?" "Felix Heatherset did," she intervened crossly, taking off her bonnet and running her fingers through her flattened curls. "Yes, by Jove, so it did," exclaimed the Viscount, his eyes kindling. "Like his damned impudence!" Fortunately, since his mood was becoming increasingly belligerent, he was diverted by Mr. Fancourt, who suddenly offered to set him a main. He turned to find that his amiable friend, losing interest in the conversation, had seated himself by the table in the middle of the room, produced a dice-box from his pocket, and was engaged in throwing right hand against left. Drunk or sober, the Viscount was not the man to refuse a challenge of this nature. He instantly sat down on the other side of the table and, to Nell's relief, became absorbed in his ruling passion. From this he was momentarily disturbed by the entrance of the footman, who came in bearing 2 tankards, which he silently set down at either gentleman's elbow. Dysart, staring at them, demanded to know what the devil he thought he was doing, and told him to bring a bottle of brandy. The footman bowed and withdrew, saying, "Very good, my lord," but he did not remove the homely tankards. Nor did he return to the library, but as the Viscount immediately struck a run of amazing and most unaccustomed good fortune, his failure to bring in the brandy went unnoticed, both gamesters refreshing themselves with draughts of porter, and Dysart, having rapidly relieved Mr. Fancourt of his ready money, beginning to amass a number of notes of hand, which that well-breeched young gentleman scrawled somewhat illegibly, but with the greatest good-will, on leaves torn from his pocket-book. Meanwhile, Mr. Heatherset, to whose thoughtful offices they owed a beverage well known for its sobering quality, had suffered a check. Farley was unable to tell him where his master had gone when he left the house earlier in the evening. Mr. Heatherset eyed him. "Dashed discreet, ain't you? Did you go off with Sir John Somerby?" "No, sir, although I had understood that such was his intention. A meeting at the Daffy Club, sir, I fancy, but his lordship cried off." "Well, there's no need to make a mystery of it," said Mr. Heatherset, irritated. "Where did he go?" "That, sir, I cannot say, his lordship not having informed me. He had his whisky brought round, but he didn't take his groom with him, nor yet his tiger, and when I ventured to ask him if he would wish supper to be prepared for him, he said that he didn't know when he should be returning. His lordship appeared, sir, to be in quite a fret, if I may say so, not at all like himself." The mystery was now plain to Mr. Heatherset. In his experience, it was a foolish waste of time to attempt to hoodwink one's servants. He had not for a moment imagined that the supposed secret of Letty's flight was not known to every member of the household, so he had no hesitation in saying bluntly, "Set off after Lady Letitia, did he? Oh, well, if that's so, no need for me to find him." "No, sir," replied Farley. "His lordship was not aware that her ladyship had not returned to the house. I was not myself aware of it until Miss Sutton, my lady's dresser, sir, informed me that Lady Letitia was gone to spend the night with Mrs. Thorne. His lordship did not inquire for Lady Letitia. It was my Lady Cardross which his lordship was anxious to find." He coughed delicately. "No doubt some urgent matter which he wished to discuss with her ladyship," he said, gazing limpidly at Mr. Heatherset, "being, as they were, disturbed by Sir John Somerby, and her ladyship, in consequence, leaving the book-room rather hastily, sir." "Oh," said Mr. Heatherset, looking at him very hard. "Yes, sir, so soon as he was as soon, I should say, as Sir John left the house, his lordship went upstairs to find her ladyship, which, not being able to do, vexed him a trifle. Quite put out he was, which was not to be wondered at, because it seems her ladyship forgot to inform him she was obliged to go out quite suddenly, and of course his lordship couldn't help but be in a fidget when he found that my lady's carriage had not been sent for. Very understandable, I'm sure, sir, that his lordship should have felt anxious, for it was going on towards dinner-time, and naturally he wouldn't like to think of my lady's going out in such a way, particularly," he added in a disinterested voice, "if she was going on a journey." "Is that what he thought she was meaning to do?" demanded Mr. Heatherset. "Well, sir, that's not for me to say," replied Farley carefully, "but when his lordship questioned George, it came out that her ladyship had sent down to have her dressing-case taken up to her room. Just after she had parted from his lordship, that would have been." He looked Mr. Heatherset firmly in the eye, and said, "What I thought, sir, was that very likely her ladyship had had word brought to her that my Lord Pevensey was lying on his deathbed, perhaps, which would account for her going off like she did, being quite distracted, which no one could wonder at." "Yes, well, you can stop pitching your gammon," said Mr. Heatherset indignantly. "Just well ought to know better. Must know I ain't such an easy cove as to swallow all that humdudgeon. I know what you thought, and it was a bag of moonshine." "Yes, sir," said Farley, bowing. "I am very glad of it. I apprehend that her ladyship went in search of Lady Letitia, but on that subject I shall not presume to open my lips." "Well, see you don't," recommended Mr. Heatherset. He then repaired to the library, where the Viscount, intent upon throwing a difficult chance, did not at first notice him. Nell, seated on the sofa at the end of the room, was a good deal dismayed to see him come walking in, for she had supposed him to have gone in search of Cardross. It was evident, since he had shed his cloak, that he had no immediate intention of leaving the house, and she could not help looking reproachfully at him as he came towards her. "No use," he said, in an under voice. "Floored at all points. Farley don't know where Cardross is. Seems to me he's making a dashed cake of himself. But I wouldn't be surprised if he's gone off to Devonshire." "Gone off to Devonshire?" she echoed in amazement. "Nonsense! Why would he do such a thing?" "Chasing after you," he said. "Shouldn't think he'd be such a gudgeon as to set off in a whisky, but he may have hired a chaise. Left the whisky at the posting-house." Quite bewildered, she said, "But why should he think I'd gone to Devonshire? Oh, Felix, are you foxed too?" "No, of course I ain't. Been talking to Farley. No wish to pry into what don't concern me, but collect she had a turn-up with Cardross." He added hastily, as the colour rushed into her cheeks, "Not my business. The thing is, Giles found you wasn't in the house. Couldn't discover where it was gone, and, by what I can make out, was thrown into a rare taking. Silly gape-seed of a porter told him some faradiddle about taking your dressing-case up to your room. Sounds to me as if he was pitching it pretty rum, but can't be surprised it put Cardross in the devil of a pucker." "Oh, my good God!" she exclaimed guiltily. "That was only to draw George out of the hall. How could he suppose—" She stopped and turned apprehensive eyes towards him. Did the servants think I had run away?" "Lord, yes. Bound to," he replied. "However, it don't signify. What I mean is, you hadn't." "No, indeed. But to have caused such a commotion, set them all gossiping. Oh, do you think he will be very angry with me?"
No, no. Might be in a myth, I dare say, but he'll come about, he said soothingly. Must see you meant it for the best. Not your fault you made a mull of it.
This well-meant consolation caused her to spring up, wringing her hands.
Letty, she uttered, Felix, it is my fault. Oh, if I had but told him, he never will forgive me.
The Viscount, his attention jerked from the bones by her unguarded movement and raised voice, looked round.
What the deuce? Well, by God, if that fella Heatherset hasn't come sneaking back. What, are you still castaway? Said Mr. Heatherset disgustedly. I wish you'd take yourself off. Oh, you do you? Countered his lordship. Well, I'm not going to stir from this house while you're in it, my buck. You may depend on that.
Mr. Fancourt, with a hazy recollection of earlier events, looked puzzled and said,
But you don't like him, Di. You said you were going to throw him out.
Felix, said Nell, too lost in agitated reflection to heed this interchange, there is nothing for it but for me to go after them. It may not be too late.
Good God, cousin, you can't do that, said Mr. Heatherset, shocked.
If I went in our own chaise, and you were so very obliging as to go with me, she urged, it may be hours before Giles returns, and then—
Well, upon my soul!
ejaculated the Viscount, rising with such hasty violence as to overset his chair.
If that don't beat all hollow!
He seized his sister by the shoulders and shook her.
Have you taken leave of your senses? He demanded. Go off in a chase with that fellow? Not while I'm here to stop you.
He rounded suddenly on Mr. Heatherset, an ugly look on his face.
What damned cajolery have you been playing off on her? He said fiercely. For the Lord's sake, Dysart, go and dip your head in a bucket, begged Mr. Heatherset.
Oh, listen, Nell said sharply, her face turned towards the door. A quick stride was heard approaching, the door was flung open, and Cardross stood on the threshold. There was a hard, anxious look on his face, and he had not stayed to put off his long, many-caped driving coat. His eyes swept the room and found his wife. He went quickly forward, totally ignoring the rest of the company, saying in a shaken voice which she hardly recognized,
"Nell, thank God. Oh, my darling, forgive me."
"Giles, oh no, it was all my fault," she cried, casting herself into his arms.
"And it is much, much worse than you know. Letty has gone with Mr. Allendale."
"Damn Letty," he said, folding her close. "You have come back to me, and nothing else is of the smallest consequence." Mr. Heatherset, averting his eyes with great delicacy from the passionate embrace being exchanged, began to polish his quizzing-glass. The Viscount stared in thunderstruck silence, and Mr. Fancourt, after blinking at the extraordinary spectacle offered him, rose carefully to his feet and twitched his friend's sleeve. "Think we ought to be taking leave, Di," he said confidentially. "Not the sort of party I like, dear boy. Go for a toddle to the mutton walk." "Damned if I will," replied Dysart. "I want a word with Cardross, and I'm going to have it." Recalled to a sense of his surroundings, Cardross looked up. Flushing a little, he let Nell go. "By all means, Dysart, what is it?" "I'll tell you in private," said the Viscount, in whom the effects of his potations were beginning to wear off.
"Well, I don't know why you should suddenly wish to be private," said Nell, with unusual asperity, "when you have been saying the most abominable things without the least regard for anyone, even the hackney coachman. Besides trying to call poor Felix out in the most insulting way. Oh, Giles, pray tell him he must not do so."
"But why in the world should he wish to?" asked Cardross, startled and considerably amused. "Silly Clunch saw her ladyship coming away from Allendale's lodging with me, and would have it that it was my lodging," said Mr. Heatherset tersely, responding to the laughing question in his cousin's eye. "Oh, that's the tale, is it?" said the Viscount. "Well, it won't fadge. Didn't think to tell me that, did you? Why not?
That's what I want to know. Why not? Because you were a dashed sight too ripe to attend to a word anyone said to you, replied Mr. Heatherset, with brutal frankness.
And in any event, there was no need for you to behave in such an outrageous way, Di, interpolated Nell severely, even if it had been Felix's house, which it might as well have been, because I had the intention of calling on him on account of my not knowing the number of Mr. Allendale's. Only by good fortune he chanced to be coming out just as I was paying off the hack.
Yes, you have that mighty pat, haven't you, my girl, said Dysart, and I dare say you think it makes all right. Well, it don't. Pretty conduct in a female of quality, to be paying calls on every loose fish on the town, I must say. In a common hack, too. Well, that may suit your notions of propriety, Cardross, but it don't suit mine, and so I'll have you know.
Di, how can you be so absurd, protested Nell. No one could possibly think poor Mr. Allendale a loose fish.
Dash it, cousin, exclaimed Mr. Heatherset indignantly. My dear Dysart, do let me assure you that I honour you for such feelings, and enter into all your ideas on the subject, said Cardross. You may safely leave the matter in my hands. That's just what it seems to me I can't do, retorted Dysart. Yes, and that puts me in mind of another thing I have to say to you. Why the devil don't you take better care of Nell? Did you get her out of a silly scrape? No, you didn't. I did. All you did was to put it into her head you thought she only married you for your fortune, when anyone but a gudgeon must have known she's too big a pea-goose to have enough sense to do anything of the kind. So when she finds herself under the hatches, she daren't tell you. I have to pull her out of the river tick. A pretty time I had of it. Why, I even had that fella Heatherset hinting it was my fault she was being done for some cursed dress or other. Mr. Heatherset blushed. Misapprehension. Told you so at the time. Well, it was my fault, said Dysart furiously. I dare say if I hadn't borrowed 3 centuries from her, you wouldn't have had to snatch her off Duke King's doorstep. But how was I to know it would put her in the basket? Besides, I paid it back to her.
Nell, my poor child, how could you think? Did I frighten you as much as that? Cardross said remorsefully. No, it was all my folly, she said quickly. I thought that shocking bill from Laval had been with those others, only it wasn't, and when she sent it to me again, it seemed as though I couldn't tell you. Oh, Dysart, pray don't say any more.
Yes, that's all very well, but I am going to say something more. I've a pretty fair notion of what your opinion of me is, Cardross, but I'll have you know that it was not I who prigged that damned necklace of yours.
Eh?
Ejaculated Mr. Heatherset, startled. You have really no need to tell me that, Dysart, Cardross replied. His colour heightened, and his eyes fixed on Nell's face. Well, it's what my own sister thought, said Dysart bitterly. Good God, Giles, you've never lost the necklace? Mr. Heatherset demanded. No, answered Cardross, holding Nell's hand rather tightly. It isn't lost. If it were, I should not imagine for one instant that you had taken it, Dysart. Much obliged to you. I must say that's the outside of enough, observed Mr. Heatherset. Whatever made you take a notion like that into your head, cousin?
It was very, very foolish of me.
Well, I call it a dashed insult, declared the Viscount. Yes, Dysart, so do I, said Cardross, raising Nell's hand to his lips. I hope you have begged his forgiveness, Nell, as I beg for yours.
Oh, Giles, pray hush.
The Viscount, having frowned over this for a moment, exclaimed, What did you think she had stolen the thing? If that don't give you your own again, Nell. That's all very well, objected Mr. Heatherset, but you said it wasn't lost, Cardross. It was lost, but it has been restored to me. I suppose I now know who stole it, and should have known at the outset. Not yours, Sister Dysart, but mine. Was that it, Nell?
Well, yes, it was, she confessed. But you mustn't be out of reason cross with her, because indeed I believe she would never have thought of doing such a thing, only that Dysart put it into her head.
What? Exclaimed Dysart. No, by God, that's too much. I never did so.
Yes, Di, you did. Oh, I don't mean to say that it was what you intended, but I have been thinking about it, and I am persuaded it was your holding me up that night with Mr. Fancourt. Good gracious, where is Mr. Fancourt?
Yes, by Jove, where is he? Exclaimed Dysart. No need to worry about him, said Mr. Heatherset, nodding to where Mr. Fancourt was peacefully sleeping in a large wing chair. Wouldn't have let you all talk in that dashed improper way if he'd been listening to you. If ever I knew anyone like Corney for dropping asleep the instant he gets a trifle above awe, remarked the Viscount, eyeing his friend with tolerant affection. Don't wake him, I beg of you, said Cardross. What, my darling, had that hold-up to do with this affair? Yes, what? Demanded Dysart.
Well, you see, Giles, when I wouldn't sell any of the jewels you gave me, and I still think it would have been the most odiously deceiving thing to have done, Di, however tiresome you may have thought it of me, Dysart hit upon the notion of pretending to be a highwayman, and taking them from me in that way. Only I recognized him, so it came to nothing. But the thing was that Letty thought it had been a famous notion, and I am very sure that that was what put it into her head to sell the Cardross necklace. She broke off as a thought occurred to her. Good heavens, Letty! What are we about, wasting time in this way? Cardross, we discovered, Felix and I, that they set out only with a pair of horses. It is true that they have several hours' start of you, but Felix seems to think that you might easily overtake them before they can reach the border. I dare say I might, if I were to make the attempt, he agreed. But won't you? She asked anxiously. No, I have had my fill of driving this evening. Allendale is welcome to her. Yes, but to be married in such a way! Giles, only think what the consequences must be. I shouldn't wonder at it if it ruined him as well as her. Indeed, I never was more astonished in my life than when I learned he had yielded to her persuasions. I had not thought it of him. And for you, too, how disagreeable it must be. Oh, do pray go after them and bring her back. Dashed if I would, remarked the Viscount. Giles! He laid his hand over the small one, insistently tugging at the lapel of his coat. Hush, my love. This is where we must be guided by the judgment of that arbiter of all matters of taste and ton. Well, Felix? Mr. Heatherset, impervious to the quizzical look in his cousin's eye, took snuff in a meditative way, his brow creased. Don't fancy it'll make much difference, he pronounced at last, restoring the box to his pocket and flicking a few grains of King's Martinique from his sleeve. Bound to be a deal of gossip whatever you do. Can't suppose it won't leak out if you go careering off after Letty. Devilish nasty scene, too, if you force her to come home. Seems to have gone into strong hysterics when Allendale tried to get her to do that. Not the sort of thing I should care for. No, my God, said Cardross, with feeling. Better make the best of it, decided Mr. Heatherset. Think I'll be going now. Dare say you'd like to be left alone. Nell held out her hand to him. I have quite ruined your evening, she said contritely. Indeed, I am sorry, and so very much obliged to you. No, no, happy to be of service, he replied, bowing with exquisite grace over her hand. Besides, no such thing. On my way to White's before taking a look in at the Seftons' ball. Night's young yet. Yes, by Jove, so it is, said the Viscount. Here, Corney, wake up. Mr. Fancourt, urgently shaken, opened his eyes, smiled upon the company, and began to hum softly and unmelodiously to himself. Now, for the Lord's sake, Corney, you ain't as dead-beat as that, said the Viscount. Don't start singing again, because you know dashed well you can't do it. It's my birthday, stated Mr. Fancourt. Well, that's got nothing to say to anything. Come along. Time we were going. I could sing on my birthday,
said Mr. Fancourt. "I can sing Old Rose and Burn the Bellows, and I can sing your song, and I can—" "Chip chow cherry chow," interrupted Mr. Heatherset. "That's the one," nodded Mr. Fancourt, pleased. "You know it too." "I've heard it," replied Mr. Heatherset, rather grimly. He met the Viscount's challenging gaze and held it. "You've called me a few names this night, Dysart. Now I'll take leave to tell you that you're the biggest cod's head I ever knew." "What the devil do you mean by that?" the Viscount shot at him, flushing. "You know dashed well what I mean. You learned that song from Cripplegate." "What if I did?" demanded Dysart. "I'll tell you that, Dysart," interposed Cardross. He nodded dismissal to his cousin and looked Dysart over. "Beggars' Club, eh? Well, I thought as much. A hussar regiment should suit you. Would be a pity to waste your horsemanship. Well?" "Oh, to hell with you, I've told you I can't," Dysart said. "You'll find you can, I promise you." "By Jove, what wouldn't I give to be out there?" Dysart said impulsively. "You're going to join, Di?" inquired Mr. Fancourt, who had been following this conversation with great interest. "That's a devilish good notion. Let's go and join at once." "Well, we can't," said Dysart shortly. "Besides, you don't want to join." "Yes, I do," asserted Mr. Fancourt. "Can't think why I didn't hit on the notion before. There's nothing left to do here, except walk backwards to Brighton, and I don't fancy that above half."
"Who shall blame you?" agreed Cardross, shepherding him kindly but firmly into the hall.
"That's just it," explained Mr. Fancourt, "and I may have to. Never refused a challenge in my life, and I've a notion Willie means to try me with that one. You know Willie?"
"No, but I should lose no time in leaving the country."
"You're a sensible man," said Mr. Fancourt warmly. "Very happy to have met you."
"The pleasure has been all mine," said Cardross, putting his hat into his hand and opening the front door.
Not at all," responded Mr. Fancourt, ambling down the steps.
"Lord, if ever I saw him in such a prime and plummy order before," said the Viscount. "Now I shall have him going all over town trying to find the Horse Guards." He picked up his own hat and hesitated, looking at Cardross. Cardross smiled. "You're a damned fool, Dysart, and a damned nuisance besides, but too good a man to be wasting your talents cutting up court-brained larks. Don't tease yourself about your mother. I'll make it all right in that quarter." He held out his hand, and the Viscount took it, grinning ruefully. "I wish you might." "I will." "Devilish good of you." "Got something else to say to you, and it ain't easy. From what Nell told me, when she found herself in that fix, well, the long and the short of it is, she didn't know till I told her that you were in love with her. Thought you'd married her as a matter of convenience, and had too much civility to let her see it." He gave a crack of laughter. "Convenience! Lord, what a silly little greenhead!" "Are you serious?" Cardross demanded. "It isn't possible." "Ain't it? You don't know my mother, Cardross," said Dysart. "Good night. Must go after Corney." He went down the steps, waved, and went striding off. Cardross stood looking after him for a moment, and was just about to go back into the house when a post-chaise swept round the angle of the square and drew up below him. From this vehicle Mr. Allendale jumped down, and turned to give his supporting hand to his betrothed. "But what a charming surprise," said Cardross blandly. Chapter 15. Mr. Allendale, having paid off the postillion, took his love in one hand and Mr. Thorne's cloak-bag in the other, and trod up the steps to the front door. Here he paused, and looked Cardross squarely in the face. "I have brought her home, sir," he said. "I see you have," replied Cardross. "Most understandable, I'm sure." Letty cast a scared, resentful look up at him, but said nothing. "An explanation is due to you," said Mr. Allendale, "but first I must beg of you most earnestly that whatever wrath you may feel, and I do not deny that it is a just wrath, you will visit upon my head alone." "I fail entirely to see why I should visit my wrath on your head, but if you suppose me to be contemplating a violent revenge on Letty, do let me hasten to reassure you." "You see, love," said Mr. Allendale tenderly.
"I am not afraid of Cardross,"
said Letty in a small, resentful voice. "It would have been very much better for you and all of us if you had been," said Cardross. "Come into the house, but leave your heroism outside." He led the way into the hall, and saw Farley standing in the middle of it, with his mouth at half-cock. "Just so," he remarked. "I heard a carriage drive up, my lord," explained the butler, staring at Letty. "Yes, Lady Letty decided after all she would not spend the night in Bryanston Square," said Cardross ironically. "You may come into the book-room, both of you." He walked to the door and held it wide. Across the room Nell's eyes met his, a startled question in them.
"Giles, I thought I heard—"
"You did, my love. Can you conceive of anything more delightful? Dear little Letty is once more in our midst."
"I hate you,"
said Letty passionately, and burst into tears.
"Letty, oh, Letty, thank God you've come back," cried Nell, hurrying forward. "I wish I hadn't. I wish I were dead," sobbed Letty.
"No, no, you mustn't say that," Nell told her, putting an arm round her and stretching out her other hand to Mr. Allendale.
"Mr. Allendale, how glad I am that I wasn't mistaken in you. I couldn't think it possible that you would do such an improper thing as to elope with her."
He kissed her hand punctiliously and said, "I wish that I could find the words to express to your ladyship the sense of obligation I feel, but when I consider the circumstances and what cause you have had, the whole truth not being known to you, to think me infamous, I am rendered tongue-tied." "Not noticeably," said Cardross dryly. Nell bit her lip and drew Letty to the sofa. "Come, love, sit down beside me and try to compose yourself." She saw how anxiously Mr. Allendale was watching Letty, and smiled at him reassuringly. "She will be better directly. Don't pay any heed to her." He looked grateful, but turned with a resolute air to Cardross. "Sir, I have a duty to discharge. I speak on behalf of Lady Letitia, and I shall be brief, merely imploring you to remember that she is young and in the greatest distress, and has thrown herself upon your mercy. What I have to disclose to you cannot but shock you deeply. You do not yet know the worst, and it is my painful duty to inform you of it." "Oh, yes, I do," replied Cardross. "You were about to tell me that Letty stole the Cardross necklace." Letty raised her head from Nell's shoulder.
"It wasn't stealing, it wasn't," she declared. "It didn't belong to Nell, and she didn't even like it. It belonged to the family, and so it was just as much mine as yours, Giles."
"My love, you are forgetting that I have several times explained to you that that is not so," said Mr. Allendale gravely.
"Yes, but it is. And anyway, Giles won't let me have my fortune, so what else could I do?"
Mr. Allendale looked pained, but apparently decided that the moment was not ripe for argument. Drawing a package from his pocket, he laid it on the table before him and said, "That is the sum the necklace realized, my lord. Had I been able, I would have done my utmost to recover the necklace itself. It was not in my power, however. I have not been at liberty to repair to the jeweller to whom it was sold. I will furnish your lordship with—" "Let me set your mind at rest," Cardross interrupted. "The jeweller brought it to me earlier today, and I have already redeemed it."
"Sir, You have removed a weight from my mind, said Mr. Allendale earnestly. Yes, I expect I have, agreed Cardross. I wish you will satisfy the curiosity in mine. Was it the discovery that your bride had stolen the necklace which made you abandon your flight to Gretna Green? At what stage did you turn back? There was no such flight, my lord. No, of course not, Nell said. But where did you go, Mr. Allendale? I was guilty of practising deception, he said heavily. I need not, I hope, assure you that such a course was of the utmost repugnance to me. To deceive one so dear to me, and one who, moreover, placed the most implicit trust in my integrity, was more painful than I can describe. But when I found that no words of mine could avail to persuade my darling to return to her home, when I saw her in such agony of grief and despair—
Yes, I've seen Letty in hysterics, said Cardross. You have no need to describe the scene to me. I pity you sincerely. What, in fact, did you do?
Fearing that if I compelled her to return to this house, she might put a period to her existence, I agreed to fly with her to the border, said Mr. Allendale. She believed that we were on our way north, but it was not so. I did not carry her to Gretna Green, but to Wimbledon. There was a moment's astonished silence. To Wimbledon? Said Cardross in a voice that shook. I expect you had an excellent reason for your choice? Why, to be sure he had, exclaimed Nell, bestowing a warm smile upon Mr. Allendale. You mean you took her to your mother's house? How very wise of you. He bowed. It seemed to me, ma'am, the only course open to me. In my mother's judgment I could repose complete confidence, for her understanding is superior, her mind of an elevated order, and her firm yet tender command over my sisters, such as encouraged me to hope that over my darling also her influence would prevail. And we perceive that it did, said Cardross. My dear Allendale, why have I never been privileged to meet your mother? I would like to kill you, choked Letty. My mother, sir, seldom goes into society, said Mr. Allendale stiffly. But I hope she may be persuaded to receive me, nevertheless. I am at a loss to understand your lordship, said Mr. Allendale, more stiffly yet. I apprehend, however, that you are in funning humour. No, I am not funning, Cardross replied. Oblige me by telling me in all frankness whether or not my sister's want of conduct, her excessive sensibility, and the unscrupulous means she does not hesitate to use to attain her ends, have convinced you that she is totally unfitted to be your wife. Giles, don't, begged Nell, as Letty broke into renewed weeping. Sir, said Mr. Allendale, very pale, but steadily meeting Cardross's eyes, I do not attempt to condone her faults, though I can perceive excuses for them, but I love her, and must always do so, whatever she is, or whatever she does. Letty looked up, her tears arrested, awe in her face. Jeremy, she said. Oh, Jeremy. Cardross turned his head. You are not worthy of that, Letty. No, she said forlornly. I know I am not, but oh, I wish I were. He smiled wryly. Well, I dare say there may be hope for you. You had better marry her, Allendale. It seemed for several moments as though neither of the interested parties could believe that they had heard him correctly. It was Letty who found her voice first. Giles, do you mean now? Before he sails? Yes, that's what I mean. Oh, my dearest brother, how kind you are, cried Letty, flying up off the sofa and casting herself upon his chest. Pray forgive me for saying horrid things to you. I didn't mean them. Oh, how happy I am. Oh, Jeremy, I promise I will never do anything you don't like. Sir, said Mr. Allendale, I do not know how to convey to you my sense of your generosity, my gratitude. Then don't try, said Cardross.
You are a very estimable young man, but I should like you so much more if you would refrain from addressing me in flowing periods. I'm going to send you away now, but you may come to see me tomorrow at noon, if that should be convenient to you, when I will arrange the marriage settlements with you. You may escort him to the front door, Letty, and after you have bidden him good night, you had better go to bed.
Bed at 10 o'clock, she said, by no means pleased.
Yes, bed at 10 o'clock. If you are not exhausted after a day of unbridled passion, you should be. Don't argue with me. My patience won't stand it.
Indeed, you should go, love, Nell urged her.
You are quite worn out. I will come up to you and— No, you will not, Cardross interrupted. Overawed by this display of cool and sweeping authority, the young lovers withdrew circumspectly. Nell showed her husband a laughing countenance.
"Well, really, Giles," she expostulated.
He caught her up from the sofa and held her a little away from him, looking down into her face with bright, smiling eyes. "Yes, really, Giles," he retorted. "How much longer did you think I would wait to get you to myself?" She did not answer him, but blushed a little, meeting his gaze shyly but very openly. "There's so much to say to you, Nell, and God forgive me, so much to unsay. My darling, I wish I had cut my tongue out before—"
"No, there is nothing to unsay, because you didn't say those things to me," she intervened. "They hurt me only a very little, not as much as I deserved, perhaps, for I am afraid I have been extravagant and deceitful and very foolish."
"And above all, very foolish," he agreed, turning her words into a caress. "It seems I have been a great deal too easy with you, madam wife. That will not happen again. So you thought I offered for you because I wanted a wife, and saw nothing in you to disgust me, did you? Nell, how could you be such a goose?" The blush deepened. She hung her head.
"Mamma said that you were disposed to be fond of me and considerate, and she warned me not to hang on you, or to appear to notice if, perhaps, you had another interest."
"I am obliged to mamma. And did it seem to you that I had another interest?"
"No, but I knew," she said simply. "The first time we met, Letty said that I was prettier than your mistress."
"She was right. I wish I could think that Allendale would beat her regularly every week, but I fear he won't. The lady with whom I enjoyed an agreeable connection for several years need never have troubled you. We parted without regret or ill will, and when we meet in company today, it is with the indifferent pleasure of old acquaintances. From the moment I saw you, Nell, you have had all my heart. That is the truth."
"Dysart said that. He said that everyone knew it too."
"I infinitely prefer your brother to my sister. But why, my foolish little love, did you then keep me at an even greater distance?"
She looked up again. "You see, I owed Laval more than £300, so how could I do anything else until that dreadful debt was paid? With that on my conscience, I couldn't tell you that I had been agonizingly in love with you from the very beginning, and if you had discovered the debt, you would never have believed me. But I was, Giles."
Farley, quietly entering the room at that moment, beheld his mistress locked in a crushing embrace, and with instant presence of mind stepped noiselessly back into the hall. There he remained for some few minutes, after which, with a little fumbling with the door-handle, he entered the book-room for the second time. My lord, before the mirror above the fireplace, was pensively absorbed in some delicate adjustment to the folds of his cravat. My lady, a little dishevelled, but otherwise a model of fashionable decorum, was seated in a large arm-chair.
"I don't know how it comes about, my lord," she said in a light, languid voice, "but we do not increase our covers for guests tonight."
"But why, my love, did you not inform me of this circumstance earlier?" inquired my lord reproachfully. "I should then have used my best endeavours to have persuaded your brother and his amiable friend to have given us the pleasure of their company."
"Yes, indeed, how stupid of me," said my lady, with very creditable command over her voice.
"And Allendale," pursued my lord ruthlessly, "in case the conversation should have flagged." Pained to see such a want of chivalry in my lord, Farley came to the rescue of his sorely tried mistress, and in a few dignified and well-chosen words put an end to this scene. "Supper, my lady, is served," he announced.